That's good.
Has to be
That's good. Yeah. Right.
So that becomes a lot.
It's kind of hard
Absolutely,
to just
absolutely.
A lot of the concerns with
say,
pesticide stuff has come through.
you can get
I
a
see,
first
actually,
rough
one of the
approximation.
worst problems is people flush their pills out of their
Absolutely.
And I said, duh, why don't we get all the pharmacies to work together and you can go there and
You
give
go up
them
to
your
bird's eye
pills.
view.
I mean,
You're
you've got to do
you have
things
the
to get
worm's
people
eye view,
engaged.
right?
And
And so it's not just the pills. You think of the millions of women who are
I don't
taking the
disagree.
pills,
I don't
they go
disagree.
to the jump,
But I'm talking,
and some of
once
it comes through a
once
system.
people have that awareness, so you're not even thinking about it because it's invisible. If you don't see this. Yeah.
Worth flying to Washington.
But actually, David, we've had for the last 3 years a legislative obligation electronics shops to take back. And, you know, I mean, taking back pills is a fraction of it. If you have to take back, I mean, for Christ's sake, if you can force shops to take back messages and you can force a pharmacy to take back a few pills.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Oh, I haven't got the phone with me, Mike. Michael, this. Yeah. I'll see if we can get it photocopied. It's. I don't know. It's.
Ger Setter, who's the chief economist,
I'm in Berkeley for another 4 weeks.
He and I have breakfast every Saturday, and we keep going. Okay,
Sure.
Let's take now and look back 10 years. How many green jobs were there? You know, there's got to be some way we got to get the green jobs out there. Because we need to keep score. Honestly, we need to keep score.
Hey, yeah.
Nobody know the answer to that.
That's right.
Here's what green job is going to be.
Well, what I can give you, which is a bit better than the presentation, I've actually got a brief.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I'll tell you one other thing.
This is better. And that's a briefing came through to me for this. So I'll share that with you. This is a more generalistic thing, but that gives you a bit more of the nuts and bolts. Okay. So which department are you in? In political science. So you're in Paris?
That's right. I looked at it.
I'm on the second floor,
Is that right? Well, I've been talking. I'm going to talk to delegations. I'm working at the California Institute, so we're looking at what should we be doing. And I want to talk to them about, look.
Okay, well, I'm obviously not there this week. Next week I'm there Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday.
And these things
The week
exist.
after,
We don't have to create things. We just have to connect our green dots and start there.
Tuesday to... But I'm winding down now.
Yes.
So I leave on the 25th.
And this is what it is. You know, you stick
And the danger that we have to deal
Yeah, I'm
with.
doing a bit of visiting. I'm going up to Seattle for a weekend, and then,
To make a old
not this weekend, the weekend.
green. I mean, I know you want to
I've got a few presentations to give off
take
campus
all
as
your
well.
resources.
Thursday next
So you
week,
got
I'm talking
there's
to
that
the
resource
federal
ultimately.
EPA
But I
office in
think
San Francisco.
I've seen it. Part of the
Giving
story
a
is
presentation in Seattle.
lower
Giving another one.
the heat
Essentially.
temperature. Right in the summer.
Yeah, no,
Those
it's
2 degrees are out of your
It's a sort of
technical comfort zone.
semi-ambassadorial, semi-researching, semi... It's interesting.
That's the best way to cut back on greenhouse gas or anything else. Just don't use it.
Yeah. Well, the guy who spoke first is a colleague of mine. He's from the Environment Service, but is detached
We
as
have all that.
the
See, we
Environment
have all this
Council
stuff.
in our Washington delegation. He's the guy who spoke first.
Yes, and that's my point.
He used to
But
be a
we
colleague
have,
of mine.
we also have,
Well, we are.
but we have Fund Empire. We have the Edison Empire. We have Social Gas Empire. We have the Water Power Empire, which is not regulated by the PUC at all. And we have the Metropolitan. So we have these people. And guess what? Water ties to energy, because you have hot water. And how do they count that? Well, they actually count that against Metropolitan Water District. They count it against the gas company. So there's so much opportunity just to take what we have and put it together. That's what I want to do. Yeah, let's do it. Let's do it.
Because you've got to connect the dots. I've got what I call the regional virtual cycle. That's my
Yeah, and I'm a virtuous cycle person too.
connecting the dots. Exactly that.
The guy I used to work for at the LA Economics Institute. Everything he does, he shows you the virtuous cycle of it, you know. That's exactly what you need. All right, let's now have what?
So I'm sorry to deprive you of my.
yes, choice. It's Greek, and it comes highly recommended by Roya. How's that? Roya, she is the events manager here, and tomorrow's her last day.
We're going to be able to hold a response on that.
We'll pick it up to Bruce.
Sort of like term limits.
Did I already ask you? No, I didn't.
I will
said
be there.
You will be there.
Can I order my one now?
I thought you were gin and tonic. I was going to
You're,
have one.
you're absolutely right. Double.
Do you have a preference? Are you top shelf?
Maybe went to order.
Okay. Okay, it's 7 p.m. and yes, it's walking distance. It's right across the street from steps from DuPont Circle. Okay, I will make sure to get you a map though. Okay.
So David will make the presentation.
Ah, here we go. Okay, we'll close this.
Washington, France, Berkeley, yes. This is Washington, France, Berkeley. See this one?
Washington, France, Berkeley.
Yes.
I'm going to get some water.
Beautiful. Links to other files. Up to date.
Well, they exaggerated when I think we decided.
Oh,
Yesterday in the legal group. So
oh
that's
man.
when
Let's see what will happen. So, you know, this
Say no, Council?
Council, let's see. And let's start. Go to slide. Second.
View show.
Yes. Let's go fast.
Is everything look right so far?
That's fine.
Okay. It's one of those.
We made one or two.
Okay. One of those warnings that scares you. Oh, that's a nice one. But
Because it's really long, but it's done.
oh, okay.
Perfect.
Okay. Escape.
Gal.
Is it set up for
It's okay.
view show? And the remote?
The remote is this one. This one. Oh, this
Oh
is.
wait, I didn't save it to the desktop. I'm
Oh,
sorry.
just save it to that.
No, it's a private firm, but it's a non-profit. So we're potentially an environmental think tank. One of my projects, I we mostly work for the German government. No, try to give it to a half hour because Will said she opened up an office here. Next door. Basically, it's German right now in June. We do definitely biotechnology regulation is one issue that we haven't done a lot of work. And we are very strong in climate and energy, in some areas of agriculture, in water issues, and then we also have legal team working on health issues. About the Center for Food Safety, just briefly Googled it, but I didn't get a full
Your timing card. Okay. Anything else that you need to?
So you wanted to end at what time? But what time do you want it to end? Stay. Go to 2:40? No problem. Hey, good afternoon. My name is Sally Thompson, and I am a director at the USDA's Economic Research Service, just down the street a couple blocks. And currently I'm the director of the Market and Trade Economics Division. Those of you may be familiar or not with ERS. We do the economic research for USDA and agricultural policymakers in Washington, D.C. Besides the Market and Trade Economic Division, we also have a Food Economic Division and a Resources and Rural Economic Division. So if you're interested in learning more about what we do at ERS, please look at our website. Today I'm going to moderate this session on that's going to discuss the paper that David Zilberman's going to present in a minute on U.S. versus EU biotechnology regulations and comparative advantage, implications for future conflicts in trade. This is a paper that David is co-authored with Gal Hochman and Gordon Rauser. I guess they're both at Berkeley. And now everybody has one of these blue folders, so I don't need to get into a long intro to David, which could take an awful long time if I wanted, but I think I'll skip that. I will turn this over to him in a minute. Let me also mention we have two fine discussants here who will each speak for about 15 minutes after David's half-hour presentation. One of our discussants was unable to be here today at a hearing on the Hill, so we'll have plenty of time for question and answer at the end if everybody stays on time. So David, I'll just turn it over to you now.
Okay, thanks. Thanks a lot. It's a real pleasure. This is a topic that I've been working with many people, so I have some stuff that I took from Greg Raff and Carl Prey. Basically what I will do, I will speak about the state of agricultural biotechnology, about principles of regulation, a little bit about political economy, speak about the US versus the European attitude, and speak about the price of delay and the way forward. Okay, now, if we look at what's going on in biotechnology, agricultural biotechnology, we have two main type of varieties, Roundup Ready and BT varieties, and if in the beginning it was mostly in the US, now we see that the acreage is increasing and much of it is in developing countries. Now, but most of the countries in the world are not growing GM crop. In Africa, only South Africa and a little bit Burkina Faso and Egypt. In Asia, only India and China and the Philippines and a little bit. And in Europe, very little except Spain. Now, on the other hand, almost everyone is using food that are produced from a transgenic crop. And as I would say later on, I think that we are really in a much better shape globally because of the big production of GM, of products that derive from GM soybean. People realize that China basically double or triple its consumption of soybean in the last several years, and without the expansion of soybean in Argentina, we would have incredibly severe food crisis. Now, again, if we look at the main crop, we have soybean, cotton, corn, and canola, and we can see the soybean has the largest acreage, and adoption in the soybean is very high. And as I said before, the impressive thing about the adoption of soybean is that basically the acreage of soybean increased immensely because of Roundup Ready, because you could go to areas, especially in Argentina, where you did grow, where it was pampas before, eliminate some of the permanent weed, and suddenly you can grow soybean. Another thing that happened, soybean Roundup Ready allowed to farm sensitive land that you can use with slow tillage, but you cannot use with traditional tillage. Now, basically, we have some division of labor, that there is very little use of GM varieties in food crops, a little bit of white maize in South Africa. People now develop GM rice in China. And on the other hand, you really don't have GM in crop like cassava, potatoes, millet, and pulses, where they could have benefited from the technology. Now, again, herbicide tolerant and insect resistance are dominant. And now, if we look at the impact vary by location. In some areas, the yield effects are very high. if GM doesn't replace the pesticide. In other, it reduces pesticide use and it actually reduce health costs. So in China, the yield effect is minimal, but people use much less pesticide, and actually they showed evidence of save of life. In India, the yield effects are very high because there hasn't been any pesticide. So really, the impact vary by location. So you cannot say GM increase yield or reduce cost, depend where you are. And I think if there was something that I contribute to the literature, I really need to emphasize it. Now, if we look at why people adopt GM varieties, they reduce financial risk, they reduce work effort because basically you don't need to work pesticides. They may reduce storage losses, but of course, but sometimes they have some problems. What's going on here? Okay. Now, if we, I don't know why my computer. Okay, I'm sorry, I cannot see it on my computer, so let me hear. So if we look at, so if you look at the benefit, environmental benefits, there are several. GM reduced pesticide use. You have Roundup Ready that allow no tillage, and up to now we have a lot of accidents. We have 1 million acres annually, so it should mean something. Now, on the other end, there are a lot of problems. If you insert a trait in one variety, you lose a lot of crop biodiversity, and that is the problem. So when you introduce GM, you have to introduce it in many varieties. You have issues of resistance, but this is a new technology, and I'm sure that there will be some incidents. Now, generally, if you look at GM, relative to traditional breeding, it can enhance crop biodiversity because you have a lot of, in traditional breeding, you have 700 breeds replaced with one. With GM, you can take a trait and insert it to many varieties. So the question, will you do it or not? So if you have good infrastructure, it's easy to insert it in many varieties. You have good IPR system. You can see that there will be a lot of varieties that will have a trait. If you have a bad system, disagreement among producers, then you really lose biodiversity because you may have 2 or 3 GM variety instead of 700 that you have before. But the potential to preserve biodiversity, crop biodiversity is there. So if we look at the US, we have 1,100 varieties of soybean, 700 varieties of cotton, of corn, 19 varieties of cotton. In Argentina, you have much less varieties of soybean, both because originally you have less and because the system is much less flexible. In China, you have many more varieties than the US, and of cotton, and in India, even more. This was done many years ago. Now we have 45 big varieties in India, because in India, there are a lot of seed companies that are relatively sophisticated, so they can do it. On the other hand, if you go to Africa, I would worry about GM, because you may have 1 or 2 varieties that will replace them. So if you do it, you have to do it right, and to have many varieties. So the issue is not if GM is good or bad to the environment, how you implement it. If you implement it, but then many varieties are being introduced, it can be good. If you implement it and you have the future, you will solve a lot of environmental problems. Now, in principle, the biotech can enhance crop biodiversity because biotech basically take advantage of the most important innovation in biology of the last century, basically to discover the DNA. We have molecular and cell biology, and basically what GM is doing is what the Cohen Boyle doing in medicine, moves the gene from one method to another. Most of the medicine in the world, the advanced medicine in the world is now doing with genetic manipulation. That's what the GM are doing. So to some extent, it can provide a lot of precise improvement. And in the same way that people now can resurrect old goats, they are able to resurrect old varieties. In many cases, we eliminate many varieties because of disease. Now, if you find the right gene, you can basically improve it, restore it. Now, another issue is IPR. Now, the thing about IPR that is annoying many people is that generally when it comes to seed, it was provided by the private sector, by the public sector. Why? Because generally you sell someone seed, if you use next year, you would buy it again. So if you buy a company, you buy it from a dealer. Seed, you are from a trade. Now suddenly private company provide it, so that becomes become a little bit of a problem. And a lot of people are not used to it. But in the same way that people get used to buy oil from oil companies and they survive, I think the fact that it's the private sector is not similar. I think the big issue is how you provide concentration of IPR, and especially how you provide the capacity to introduce GM varieties or any other varieties in crops that the big companies don't want to develop. And to address this issue, we recognize that most of the innovation starts at the public sector of the university, and we have something called the PIPRA, which is Public Intellectual Property Resources for Agriculture. It's an organization that pick up intellectual property that comes from university and provide it to people to develop a variety for the poor. Moreover, what we try to do and what we should do is to educate universities, not give to companies everything when you have technology transfer agreement, but only to be precise and to give the stuff that will be developed. Actually, I was working with some people in France to develop a European PIPRA, and I know that in Scandinavia also big discussion to develop a mechanism that to allow that people that want to develop a GM or whatever other biotech varieties special crop will have access to technology. Okay, so now, with everything so good, why we have problems? Okay, now generally when you introduce a new technology, if you look from economic principles, you will introduce it if the gain to consumer and profit are greater than the environmental cost and the technology cost. But generally speaking, a company will introduce it if profit minus technology is greater than zero. So the companies from time to time will introduce companies that have high environmental costs. Or they may not introduce companies that have benefit to consumer but not benefit to profit. So you need two types of intervention. One type of intervention is environmental intervention. Another type of intervention is basically providing its action to address what we call what we are called orphan crops. Now, generally the registration process, and a lot of economists all the time say, so if you work for all your life with EPA, registration is bad. The registration process is a response to two market failures that are very important. One is informational externality. There isn't sufficient research. Companies couldn't do all the research to look at what are the environmental side effects. Someone needs to do it, and that's the result, and it's done only under regulation. And then there's the element of moral hazard, partial disclosure. You find that something is bad, you will announce it. So good regulation will make you make good research, a lot of research, and to tell the truth. And to some extent, regulation basically have to develop protective measures and expand liability. Now, if we look at the regulation on the issues of pesticides, about 10 or 7 regulations, there is basically back-end regulation planning that can run something altogether. You basically what they call ex-ante testing, the registration requirement, and then they can have many levels. They can have breadth, namely what do you test? Do you test variety? Do you test spray? What environmental impact you look for? These are very important issues, and I don't think that on a technical level we work well enough to address it. I'll speak a little bit about that. And then steps. How stringent should the test be? Because you cannot say that, you see that there is if you have a mentality of a nurse in a hospital, you have to kill all the germs. You have to be as tough as possible. But if you are thinking more in a realistic section, you have to have a trade-off. You have to be somehow in the middle. So to have an opportunity for innovation. So finding optimal regulation is important. Then you have constraint on production and distribution constraints. Where to use it, how, maybe you should do some sort of taxation. Because pesticides, you can use pesticides on everything. But if you restrict it, pesticides that otherwise will be terrible become very useful. Then you have the issue of labeling. You need to provide consumers the right to know what they're using. And then you need ex post monitoring. These are, at least in my view, this is the idea of syllabus regulation. And the truth is that in the EU, US, that's what we prescribe. They regulate it, there's a problem, but at least there is a logic behind the regulation. Now, with all the problems, the regulatory framework has a lot of redeeming features. You can look at it as half-measures, And I think that, first of all, we have something called conditional permit that allows small-scale experimentation. A lot of time reverse decision. I think it is reversal of decision. We have reassessment. And basically, I think these are three elements that are very important. Basically, but its effectiveness depends on support for public research, recognizing trade-offs, transparency, and the main flaw in the specific regulation that applies to pesticides to biotech is absolute standard and manipulation, vulnerability to manipulation. So basically, what the big problem comes to GMOs, people look at GMO in an absolute manner. It is good or it's bad. Nothing in this world, everything. You have to look at it relative. You have to look at GM cotton versus alternative. Roundup Ready versus alternative. Basically, you have to look what is the benefit in terms of eliminating outcome rather than what are the costs. So I think comparative assessment is minimal. And I think that is one big problem when we look at the new technology. Now, if we look at the US versus the EU, the framework is very similar. The problem thing is that in the EU, they basically structure is much more balanced. There is significant amount of banning of pesticides for many for many reasons. But one thing that is in both countries that allow us to take advantage of the GM already is to allow to use product of GM products, namely of GM varieties, namely soybean seed and soybean seed. Without the real problem. So all together, you can look in detail, but also in Europe, practically they ban GM, and to some cases become worse. That's what happened in Germany. Now, what was the reason? I go very, very quickly. There are different types of theories of economic theories of political economy. One is actual industry control regulator. I subscribe to more general theories. The generally different groups have different degree of power and they result in some outcomes. So basically, if we look at the GM, there are several groups. There are policymakers, consumer interests, and then each group varies by its credibility and influence. So basically, we have policymakers that generally are not that credible. Consumers generally look credible, retain a real care, and they have a lot of influence. Biotech companies are not credible. They have a lot of influence. Startup companies, which are the companies that are very, very important. These are the people that buy partners from the universities, very big companies. And in the US, to me, there's a heart of California. If you ask me what California is about, it's not a big company. They're in the world. They were in the world. Big company in California, we have small, they become big, and when they become very big, they are taken over by the European companies. See what happened to genetic and Amgen. They're against GMO, but they buy it. So to some extent, I really think that the strength of California is the startup because of this educational industrial complex. And I really think that that's something that when it comes to policy, these groups are relatively very weak. Then you have other companies which are competing input suppliers. So in the GM, it's chemical companies which have chemicals. Again, they are as credible, even less credible than biotech companies, but they have a lot of influence. Then you have academic institutions, activist organizations, and basically the environment. So these are the factors these are the groups that affect the debate about the GM. So now let's look and see. Also, so if you look at light versus heavy regulation, who wants light regulation? Obviously, venture capitalists want light regulation. Why? Every professor wants to be a millionaire, at least my friend. And they would like to work with venture capitalists and have startup and to have a startup. And they really feel that today's regulation basically keeps the market for Monsanto and the Syngenta. The other groups, the farmers, they really want solution. If it's here, it's a good solution. They will buy, but they want light regulation. Now, who don't want light regulation? A lot of environmentalists, I think it's a mistake, but they think that GM is bad. Producers of chemicals, farmers that may lose from GM, big food marketers, they don't care, but they don't want demonstration. And if they think that one group or another will demonstrate and the product that commanded, there will be enough. Now, some large biotech companies like a regulation. The big regulation of GM started in California with the regulate Roundup not Roundup, minus the thing about the strawberry.
Oh, the strawberry.
The frost. The frost.
Flavor saver.
What? No, not flavor.
Listen to me.
It was the frost. Strawberry variety that was. It's called ice minus. It's called ice minus. And basically, what happened is the scientists they realized that there was a law that was Monsanto and the environmentalists against the scientists because Monsanto realized they can control the market if everyone has to go through it. And well, the scientists wanted regulation to be more reasonable. So to some extent, it's not clear that the regulation always will be law because there is a lot of pressure to make it tough. And in developing countries, the politicians love it because we have a study in India that if you're Monsanto, you have to pay $1 million to get a permission. But if you're an Indian company that is owned by a relative, you have to pay less. But to some extent, there is a lot of people think that the government is always on the side of regulated agencies. It's not true. So basically, that is the issue of shaping consumer perception. So basically, a lot of issues that really relate is what does the consumer think, and consumer attitude basically affect retailer attitude. So if we look at what's the difference between US and Europe, I really don't think it's necessarily consumer attitude. A lot of studies done by people in this room, so the attitudes are more or less same. But the things that first the chemical companies in Europe stood to lose from GM, and secondly, I see the American companies sold GM, especially Monsanto, in a way that was very smart. They were too aggressive. So if we really look at what really happened is that basically the US spent much more on agri-sales because of the nature of the system in regular and sales biology in Europe. And also, Monsanto basically gave up on a lot of the chemical and invested a lot on the GM. So basically, if we look at licensing, even in Europe, there was a time in Europe, so this is basically registration of trade in Europe. So basically, this was the only time period that there were more registration in trade in Europe by European companies than American companies. During this period, most of the trade were registered by American companies, and during this period it was registered by American companies. So most of the, even in Europe, most of the registration was done by American companies. In the US, obviously, the US companies were registered most of the trade. Notice that after the European ban, instead of going this way, everything got right. So basically, this is a registration, and you can really see that the US company registered more. If you look at partnership, this is when it come to Biotech patents. So you see we don't have this here. In pesticides, the relationship is more or less the same. Now, if we really look at the issues of sales, you can see that most of the sales in the pesticide area was done by European companies. The Americans were very small, and now with GM, they took quite a big market share. So to some extent, there was, I cannot say there was quite a strong interest by European companies to keep GM slow till they will catch up and get access to intellectual property. Now, what about farmers? Both in the US and Europe, some farmers like it, some farmers hate it. US wheat and Canadian wheat market killed GM wheat. Why? Because they saw that the prices were very low and they didn't want it. They also were afraid that they would be able to sell it in Europe. Now that the price of wheat is very high, the Canadian wheat and the North Dakota wheat farmers go and ask Monsanto to develop a GM wheat. So it's not only American farmers, it's European farmers. Now, traditionally, all over the world, we have a system that basically scientists develop technology without consultation with the farm sector. Because even in the 19th century, farmers didn't want new technology. Who suffered from new technology? Farm prices went down. Consumers were better off. So today, both European and American farmers have a lot of time of fault here. They are for it when they can make money, they have a disease, etc. Now let's look at science. And here I think you have something interesting. In the US, the biggest pusher of GM technology, and people educated the public will decide. They knew that they benefit from it, they want to play with it. What happened in Europe? And here I think something that is strange. In Europe, the European scientists realized that even if they develop something cannot patent it, they are dependent on Monsanto, they didn't get access to technology, and since the European scientists basically stayed on the sideline. In the US, journalists came to California, and I think that Berkeley is as liberal as any European place. To convince people in Berkeley about how Berkeley is. And all our faculty in Berkeley worked very hard in 1991 to say, God, this is our technology, we don't know what we're doing. And at the end, they convinced the Berkeley people more or less to support it. Even though that Alice Walker, who only said believe and everyone laughed, was against it. But what happened in Europe, scientists that are here didn't want to do the dirty work of Monsanto. And I think that has more to do with what's going on than almost anything else, at least in my view. Now, if you look at the European consumer, the Europeans, some of them are green, some of them hate it, but other one, for others, it became a symbol of American technology. Some don't trust the government because it's medical, and some basically look at GM as another embodiment of George Bush. Basically, the U.S. is against the U.S. is the biggest proponent of climate change. We don't want to stop it. We use all these big cuts, and now we give them GMO. All went together. So I think that to me was the European perception, and Monsanto. So basically, Monsanto, Cheney, and Bush went together. And I tell B2B, I'm rational because my emotions think the same. But we really have to be rational to look at the technology and see that there are solutions. Now, so basically, the other thing was the private sector. I think the companies that killed GM more than anyone else was McDonald's that they banned GM potatoes. So think potatoes were actually a good product, and McDonald's didn't want, they really don't want to have people basically flock into the store. So to some extent, a lot of the regulation really represents some of this stuff. So what are the results? The result is that basically we reduce food supply, we have a second generation of biotech that suffered, and we are where we are. Now, what happened in the rest of the world? Africa is generally influenced by Europe, South Africa, Burkina Faso are exceptions. Now, I'll speak later on about China. China invested in GM varieties, and they eventually would use it. India adopted BT cotton, but it's not clear if they will adopt BTC. And in South America, the big success story was what happened in Argentina and to some extent Brazil. I really think that people worry where will the food come from. And every generation we have the Green Revolution, I think we have the same role. And I'll do some historical analysis. And what really happened with the Green Revolution in China, it really did devastate the food market because of the food supply in Latin America. So basically what happened is that altogether the regulation, I think, resulted in productivity loss, environmental loss, and slow development of new technology. I like to show, if you look, this is rice. In rice we have very little changes in productivity, in the yellow. This is last 40 years. This is the Green Revolution since the announcement. The egg, what happened to inventory? Inventory is going down. Rice is a very, very vulnerable problem. Productivity hasn't grown. We have rice side. Last year it was really bad. Now it's a little bit better. In the future it's big when it comes to rice. Now if we look at wheat, we benefited a little bit from the Green Revolution. Not doing very well either. So let's say it's bad. Now soybean is a different story. Look at the acreage of soybean. And the yield of soybean went up. The yield, you don't see a big yield effect because the acreage of soybean increased immensely over a period of 40 years. And this is to large extent because of GM. Now, if you look at cotton yield really jumped. And now I do this regression analysis, but I'm sure that people don't see there is already an R-square of p-values. But what happened with soybean, with cotton, stocks of cotton are high, yield of cotton are high, price of cotton are low. So farmers are losing, but society is doing well. Why? Everyone adopts soybean. Moreover, the acreage of cases tell you there is a big potential for a lot of improvement. So now, the best example that I have is establishing in the corn. So these are countries that adopted, these are countries that didn't adopt it. You can look at the huge examples. And it's a consistent with the theory. In the text are in developing countries, and they are influenced by European or US countries, US, they are in Africa, and in fact they don't adopt it, tells you that there's a big loss. Okay. Now, obviously we speak about generation. Third generation is still limited, doesn't get a thing in the world. If we produce a different set of things in the second generation, things can be better. Now we have some examples of the second generation. We speak about amino acid. Basically, both the second generation are better feed products and also healthier foods. But to some extent, investment in the second generation faster after the European decided de facto in 1999 to ban GM. This was a shape of the technology before 1999. It went down after 1999. I have a lot of examples. For example, this is the number of approvals in the US. You see, it went this way and it went this way. This is what happened in the EU. Number of the trade that went up is going right in this direction. Before 1999, now it's going up again. So basically, regulation changed the dynamics. Agriculture people decided, okay, let's not invest in agriculture, let's instead invest in mortgages and in real estate. So it can, I made it a little too much. But to some extent, if you're in investment business every time you have something low, and agriculture not did become a hot industry after 1999, it might have been good for the environment, but this is the fact, because actually a lot of measures that can tell you, and a lot of the Biotech Companies really like this much after 1999. So now, what will happen when we move forward? We'll have to speak about several issues. First, we'll speak about biotech policy in the context of risk management, speak a little bit of acceptance, regulation, and maybe a global step. First, risk management. Generally speaking, rational risk policy, and almost all of us use the same rules. And you can use this model to have a precautionary principle and other things. We have several papers in the top-notch economics journal, UJE, that show it. Basically, the basic idea is that you either maximize risk reduction given the economic cost, or you maximize social welfare subject to a level of risk. We did it actually as a project for EPA many years ago, and we can almost all the best policy can be analyzed within this framework. So, but what really determines risk? What do you consider a risk campaign? You consider only exact risk or alternative. That is the start. I think you have to consider alternative risk. Now, precaution, at least in my book, is not avoid risk, but being smart about it. Because it's not zero. Being smart about it. And the last point that is important, any technical risk is that not taking risk is risk. There are big risks, small risks, and you have to think about it. So if you look at the issues of the risks that you have to take when it comes to GM, you have to take food shortages, environmental degradation, market concentration, for example. If you have regulations, only one company can meet. It's debt, poverty, and political instability. But I think the big one, in my view today, when it comes to the environment, is climate change. You know, people can worry about inflow, but you can always use tractors and you can use fire to eliminate that problem. Climate change is a problem. So to some extent, not the GM is the only solution, it's not solution, but within this context, it's very, very, it's quite useful because it's not only GM by itself, because GM is a gate to all the molecular and cell knowledge that can go in agriculture. And I really think that biocontrol is not the only solution, but biotech is not the only solution. It can complement biocontrol, eco-agriculture, and organic. And now I tell you something. That's my view. I've been in university for many years, and I think that it's really crucial. In my university, Berkeley decided one day we go and do here. What happened? All the people that do entomology were told, you have 60 faculty, go to 40 faculty. A lot of the people that were doing plant pathology went down to a position for all these new people. There was a revolution. between people that are basically doing biocontrol or whatever, and and to some extent, we all can live together. It's not a fight. There are something that all of you know a guy named Miguel Atieri. Miguel Atieri is a wonderful man, but he is worried that if tomorrow we will have too much GM, we will be unemployed. I don't think so. I think the GM can work together with precision agriculture because if you have many varieties, then you can use precision better. It can work with biological control, and it can work with eco-agriculture. I think organic will be much better off if you can use more sophisticated varieties, and then there will be more workforce. Rather than you use a lot of things that look good but are not so good for the environment. So to me, there are a lot of trends that we ignore. Now, my dream about all these things is to have between Europe and the US, to have, I wrote it at 3 o'clock at night, to have a trade between Kyoto versus Biotech. We buy Kyoto, Europe buy Biotech. And together are all the numbers. Now, the other thing is the issues of acceptance. And the issue, and to me, that's a big issue, because once people decided that GM is bad, it's like Jewish people that don't eat food. You know, I was brought up with pizza bread. It took me about 20 years till I had my first piece of bacon. It was nothing. So I think what happened is that to some extent, you basically have a situation that you have to respect consumer acceptance and you have to educate consumer acceptance. But in order to do it, to have honest consensus, we have to train the consumer about relative risk, and also we need to have labeling to mediate to say when this allows labeling. Because people have a right not to eat something, and we need to tell them what is there. So labeling was essential. It was a big concern. Now, to me, the big issue is today is vegetarian. Almost every study says that if you food, and GM food in the test in Europe, you will buy. It's a little bit more difficult in Korea, but people buy. Now, the other thing is regulation. Regulation design is tougher, is not better. Because you really want to have a bad GM industry, you have regulation of every place. If you have regulation of every possible place, you have one or two varieties, you have regulation at the level of the variety, not the place. Namely, every time that you insert a GM in a variety, you have to go through the test. That will be a disaster. We said GM will be that you really like to regulate at a very level and allow it to spread to as many varieties as possible, then you can present then you can present biodiversity. Regulation at the level of the variety is a disaster. You really have to identify what are the critical points where you can make mistakes and expose it and regulate there. But otherwise, then the technology evolves because the success of GM is that it is ready to many varieties to present biodiversity. And it's an incremental technology, it's not a radical technology. Okay, good. Now, move very fast. Now, so let's look at the political picture. My feeling is that in the EU, things will be better for a while. Why? Because a lot of Germany, like Sarkozy, according to rumor, said, I will continue to ban GM for nuclear expansion. I will do the same thing if I was here. So to some extent, in Europe, we'll have some time till technology will be introduced. People need to be aware about it and to look for opportunities. When you have a new food crisis, when biofuel become more of a factor, when people realize that we will need supply, it will be introduced as a food crisis. Now, what happened is that in Asia, I think that it will move very fast. The Chinese invested a lot, and they are out, and there nothing happened. Now they have now it's 2 or 3 new type of varieties that are being ready to be introduced, especially given the food crisis. They also feel much more confident about the safety of the GM, and the Chinese leadership made some statement that they will go with. Now, in Africa it's expanding. I think that it's expanding throughout Africa, and I think the Gates Foundation will develop a drought-tolerant variety, will be something that will be that will get technology to move forward. So now, what happened in the US? What happened in the US quite problem. People will introduce GM wheat. Because of biofuel, people will introduce, and actually European are going to do that. develop corn that will be good for biofuel. There will be a lot of, and people now will start developing some trait and special crops, and then we will be produced every time we get food crisis. So to me, it will happen in the US relatively slowly. Latin America, it will go further. So generally, if you look at the GM, it's really important application of new knowledge in molecular and cell biology. It's working from in the car after 10 years before Model T. Adopting is very risky, but we know it will be this year. The acceptance in Europe and the power of the wind, it become a symbol for good power. Basically, slow introduction. But I think that we pay the price for the slow introduction. And to some extent, if we basically think about slowly introduce regulation that would allow flexibility and develop institutions that allow people to have access to intellectual property, like eventually it will become commonplace. I don't see it as an alternative agriculture. I see it something that goes with organic and eco-agriculture and everything else. And I really think that it's a technology that is like a green technology in it. It takes advantage of science and it's very interesting.
Okay, let's move on to what our first discussant, Mr. Bill Freeze, who is with the Center for Food Safety, and his bio is in here, so I'll let him just go ahead now.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I'm the science policy analyst with the Center for Food Safety, and we're a nonprofit group based in DC, and we support sustainable agriculture, and we're kind of a watchdog group with respect to new food production technologies, including agricultural biotechnology. I've worked on this issue now for 10 years, first with Friends of the Earth, and I've had extensive experience dealing with the regulatory agency submissions that companies make to the regulators and the USDA, the EPA, the FDA, how they, respond to the companies. I also co-authored a peer-reviewed paper on the regulatory system in the U.S. and corporate testing practices with genetically engineered crops with a Salk Institute cell biologist. So I have a lot of experience in this issue, and I have to say I find a lot of, I'm going to take issue with some of the things that David presented. And I think one of the main things is, it seems to be that there's this kind of general presumption that biotech is good. And a lot of it has to do with an overemphasis on, I think, the BT trait and this notion that GM crops reduce pesticide use. But if you look at what's really planted, what you see is that herbicide-tolerant crops are much more prevalent than the BT. And I have biotech industry figures here that show that 85% of GM crop acreage in the world, 85% have an herbicide tolerance trait. Now, some of that is stacked with the BT. Some of it is just, the herbicide tolerance alone, but it's by far the biggest application. It's about 2.5 times more prevalent than the BT trait. And this is from the International Service for Acquisition of Agrobiotech Applications, and it's a group that's funded mostly by the biotech industry. And what we see is that the Roundup Ready crops are the main herbicide-tolerant crop. And what we've seen is that with the massive adoption of Roundup Ready crops, there's been a huge increase in glyphosate use. In the United States, where we have the best figures, it's a 10-fold increase in glyphosate use. That's the active ingredient of Roundup from 1995, before Roundup Ready soybeans were introduced, until 2005. Now, that did displace some other herbicides that were being used. But what we're seeing is that this overuse of this one chemical to kill weeds has created an epidemic of resistant weeds, just like bacteria become resistant to antibiotics. And according to the best figures from the International Survey of Herbicide-Resistant Weeds, we have up to 5.4 million acres of weeds that have become glyphosate resistant. And this is just in this decade. And weed scientists attribute that to excessive use of glyphosate with this Roundup Ready system. And now what it's been leading to in recent years is, increasingly farmers are being told, look, you've got to use other chemicals with glyphosate or you'll just get, a continuation of this pesticide treadmill effect. One of the responses of the biotech industry to this problem is to develop new crops resistant to other herbicides. And this is actually the biggest research focus of the biotech industry. All right, it's new herbicide-tolerant crops. And so what we have is, of the crops that are currently being considered for approval by USDA, and basically they all get approved. It's kind of, you know, hard. I've never seen a rejection. 6 of 14 are herbicide-tolerant. Several are new glyphosate-tolerant varieties, which we don't need because they'll just enhance the resistant weed problem. But others are resistant to multiple herbicides. And further down the line, we have Monsanto and BASF teaming up on what's called dicamba-resistant soybeans. Dicamba is a nasty herbicide that is not used a whole lot now. If these dicamba-resistant soybeans are introduced, the use will increase greatly. Well, guess what? BASF is the major producer of dicamba. So I think this, this whole notion that the European agrochemical industry is supporting, I don't know, tough EU regulations because, they're hurt by reduced pesticide use. I mean, there's no basis for fact in that, frankly. The top 4 biotech companies, okay, are Monsanto, DuPont, Syngenta, and Bayer. Okay, those 4 companies are obviously agrochemical companies which have all purchased, seed firms. So those 4 companies sell about 41% of the commercial seed supply. It's not too surprising that they're interested in genetically engineering the seed varieties they purchase to be used with their chemicals, right? And then when, that's not the case, when BASF, they actually do have some crops in the works, herbicide-tolerant crops in the works, but they also team up with a company like Monsanto that does have an herbicide-tolerant crop. So in any case, this is a false dichotomy, this idea that there's some sort of, war between the EU and Europe. The Americans are supporting reduced pesticide use, and the Europeans are the bad guys who, aren't concerned about the environment. I don't know where that comes from, but there's nothing there. There are just a lot of other issues here. A lot of what we think we know about biotech crops, and this was reflected in some of David's presentation, is from the white papers, unpeer-reviewed studies that are produced by a whole plethora of groups that are, basically funded by the biotechnology industry. I've looked at some of their studies. The National Center for Food and Agriculture Policy is one that turns out a lot of studies which they're called often simulation studies where they make false assumptions about, for instance, how much pesticide a farmer uses on a Roundup Ready crop versus a conventional crop, and then based on these erroneous assumptions, they blow this up into national estimates. And when I compare these white papers, these simulation studies with official USDA data on pesticide use, there's huge discrepancies. And so I could go on and on with this. UCS, the Union of Concerned Scientists, just put out a report called Failure to Yield, which took a really careful look at the yield of GM crops, corn and soybeans. And what UCS found was that Roundup Ready soybeans have had no positive impact on yield whatsoever. In fact, there's research out there showing a yield drag with Roundup Ready soybeans due to the genetic modification process. This is a peer-reviewed paper from the University of Nebraska. Now, in corn, there's a slight yield advantage through reduced harvest losses, right, from the insects that infest corn. But the fact is, the European corn borer is not so bad in the U.S., and so that yield advantage, if you average it over the national acreage of corn, isn't very great, and it's only 3 to 4%. The total yield, this is over the period of biotech crop introduction, GM corn introduction, okay, 3 to 4% yield advantage from the BT traits over that period. The overall yield increase has been 28%, and that's due to just conventional breeding to increase the intrinsic yield potential of the corn. So anyway, these are just a few facts that get obscured because, unfortunately, certain views get privileged, others get ignored just because of the power of the people presenting them and whose interests they serve. I could talk a lot about other stuff. I mean, I'll just go briefly and talk about intellectual property rights. In 2005, we did a report called Monsanto versus U.S. Farmers, where we interviewed dozens and dozens of farmers who'd been sued by the company for allegedly infringing Monsanto's patents. And I would urge you to take a look at this because the stories are incredible. I mean, Monsanto hires private investigators to go to farmers' fields and basically threaten them with loss of their farms if they don't immediately sign information release forms, which gives the company access to all farmers' records and allows the company to make a case against the farmer that the farmer saved seeds, which is now illegal if they're patented. And in fact, we've looked at court records and found that through 2007, farmers had paid Monsanto $21 million in these patent infringement cases. And if you include out-of-court settlements, the figure is much bigger. It's over $85 million. Right? And this is due to this misguided seed patenting that the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office allowed. What we should have is the Plant Variety Protection Act, which was passed by Congress in 1970 to give seed firms protection on their seed varieties, but which explicitly gave farmers the right to save and replant seeds and researchers to use those seeds for further breeding work. That's a big topic. Just a few other things that relate more to the paper, I guess, that David wrote. I will note that when the paper talks about, advantages like increased yield and reduced pesticide use, the references weren't included in the bibliography, and so I don't know, there were a lot of things that I couldn't check up on. But, David mentioned substantial equivalence, suggesting that it's only the U.S. that uses that approach. Actually, the EU also bases its regulation on substantial equivalence. The difference is that in the U.S., it's just basically assumed with very little evidence to back it up. It's assumed unless there's a hugely glaring, obvious reason that it doesn't apply. And just to be clear, substantial equivalence says that the GM crop will be considered the same as a conventional crop, and that's the basis for the regulatory system. In the EU, substantial equivalence is also used, but it's only a starting point, and then more careful testing is required in the EU than in the US to demonstrate that. Precautionary principle, David said, it's a zero-risk regulatory regime that, in the EU has adopted the precautionary principle. This is actually a misrepresentation of the principle, and I think it's easy for a non-scientist to, not quite understand what this principle means. And basically, it's a principle that's used in, especially like with cutting-edge science and technologies where we still have a lot to learn. There's still a lot of gray. Science is often not black and white. It seldom delivers like 100% black or white answers, especially, again, when the science is relatively new. And so, example of this is concerns with allergenicity of genetically engineered crops. There's a lot of concern about that. Food allergists have expressed lots of concerns and developed protocols which are never followed by the companies, by the way. And, okay, anyway, so this is one example. Let's see. I guess one real big issue is trust. There's a legitimate lack of trust in the regulatory regime, both here and in Europe. And a few years ago, there was a corn variety, MON 863 from Monsanto. Monsanto submitted a summary of a 90-day rat study, feeding trial that it had done. And there were, the people who reviewed it in Europe said, wait a minute, there's some cause for concern here. They demanded the full study. Monsanto refused, calling it confidential business information. It was only a German court had to force it to release this study for review by independent scientists who subsequently found that it was a completely flawed study. It just, in numerous ways, significant differences were ignored between the control group and the group that ate the corn. Austrians recently did a long-term feeding trial on mice. Fed a certain genetically engineered corn variety and found suggestive evidence, again, this is a gray area, of reduced fertility in the mice that were fed this genetically modified corn. 18% fewer offspring over a period of 13 weeks, right? The mice pairs had 4 litters over that period, and the ones that were fed the GM corn had 18% fewer pups. Now, this is not solid, complete, foolproof evidence, but, the scientists said, yeah, we need to do follow-up studies on this. We don't have long-term feeding trials. The regulators don't require it either in the US or in Europe. Okay, just one final thing. In the New York Times recently, there was an article in which 26 corn insect specialists came out. They sent this extraordinary statement to the EPA saying, we cannot get seeds from the biotech companies for testing purposes because we're not allowed to grow these seeds. And there's a lot of concern with insect resistance to Bt, which has actually recently been discovered in the U.S. And what they basically said is that there's so much corporate control of science on GM crops in the United States that the EPA is basing its decisions, for instance, on Bt crops, on the company-provided data that's often not looked at by independent scientists. Thank you. Sorry, I went over.
Oh, no, you're fine. Thank you, Mr. Fries. I know David's chomping at the bit, but let's go on to our next discussant, our final discussant, and then I'll give you a chance to reply to both. Finally, we've got Ms. Christiane Ger Setter, who is a lawyer and a researcher at the Ecologic Institute in Berlin. Again, her bio is in here, so I'll just turn it over to her right now.
Okay, thank you. And also thank you for inviting me to be here. I'm very happy to be able to connect to this project also because the institute that I'm working for, which is a private environmental think tank, does a lot of work also on transatlantic relations and transatlantic regulatory differences. So it's very interesting. It's very interesting to be here. About paper and the presentation, I would like to make a few comments, and I would like to say first that I have some problem with that because there are two versions of the paper. One of them I just got this morning, and then there's a presentation which mentioned a lot of points that were not in the paper. So I hope to not be misrepresenting any of the points, and we'll just try to comment both a bit on the paper and a bit on the presentation. Listening to what both of you have said so far, I'm glad at least to say that I think the opinions over GMOs are not strictly divided by transatlantic lines, but rather in different ways. What I found very interesting about your paper, David, was the attempt to look at the structure of the biotech industry and to see how that would actually impact regulation. I think that is a very interesting point, which is mostly done by NGOs, complaining about corporate power, but it's not very often, or at least I'm not aware of that, by academics. So I think this is a really important, interesting aspect for me. Now I would like to comment on a few points where I actually do not agree with you, and I would start with some comments on the presentation we've just heard, which I'm sure that they are also in the paper. First of all, maybe on the situation in Europe concerning the permission of GM crops. I think you said in your presentation that they are virtually banned, and it's almost not possible to get permission for GM cultivation in Europe. Now, the situation as it is I think, slightly more complex. In Europe, we have a regime with two major pieces of legislation. One directive, which is relevant for approving GM cultivation, that is the deliberate release directive, and then another regulation which regulates the authorization processes for using GM as food or feed. I've just checked the list on the internet for how many of these varieties we've actually approved in Europe, and the list is about 30, I think. I didn't count, but it was roughly the number that are authorized for use as in food, and there's at least half a dozen or so varieties approved for use in cultivation, like at EU level. Now the picture is of course more complex because we have the member states. And several of the member states, among them Germany, very recently actually banned the use of certain of these varieties that are authorized at EU level. So talking about the EU in this context is rather difficult because we have the Commission, which does one thing, and we have member states which do another thing, and yet other member states which do yet another thing. So Europe is, I think, a very, very complex regulatory system in this context, and I think this should be kept in mind when talking about regulatory differences. Now, a comment on your point that on your presentation of the economic facts on GMOs. I think they are slightly more contested than came out in the presentation. An indicator of that may be that the DG Environment of the European Commission has just put out a call calling for a study to assess the economic performance of GM crops and demanding essentially a literature review. That is an assessment of the existing knowledge on this subject Now, I think if the EU Commission is willing to pay €150,000 for assessing this kind of knowledge, it's probably not as uncontested as it was presented in that presentation. I mean, there are people here who can tell more about, why the Commission won certain studies, but that's what I think about it. Then a third point concerning crop variety and how GM crops would enhance crop variety. I'm not sure that we need biotechnology for enhancing crop variety. I mean, the historical tendency is rather a decrease, I think, in crop variety. And as far as I'm aware, factors like the Green Revolution and large monocultures have a role in that. And I think biotech is also prone to lead to this kind of agriculture. I would actually rather expect the opposite from extending GM crops. These were just 3 points about the presentation. Then I would just like to relate to 2 points that are mentioned in the paper. One is the role of science or risk assessment in regulatory decision making on GMOs. The other one is GMOs in developing countries. I will start by the first point. The role of science and scientific knowledge on GMOs. As I pointed out earlier, I think that much is contested when it comes to GMOs, and I think that relates to almost every aspect. I mean, the environmental impact, the health impact, the economic impact of GM crops. So I think saying that it will be easy to arrive at a scientific consensus, as I think you did in the presentation, it's not true from my eyes. And I think we can also not, or only to a very limited extent, hope that natural science will lead us to this point. I think the fact that we have so many controversies about what actually impacts of GMO crops are shows that there's no hard, pure science which can tell us what to do with GM crops. And this is also evident, for example, from the fact that the EU in its deliberate release directive has an annex which describes the risk assessment methodology that should be used when assessing the performance of GM crops. Now, if it was so unequivocal how we should assess these risks, I think this kind of annex would not be needed. So the point of this is that we cannot hope, I think, for science to tell us what to do about GMOs, but we need to make some choices. And these, I think, need to be met at a democratic level, and they probably need to maybe made different ways in different countries. And I would contend that this should be like this. A similar point actually applies to what you said previously, that a certain kind of regulation will be adopted based on an equation of the cost. That is probably true, but then I think we have to define what is cost. I mean, what would we take into account as environmental cost, for example? What would we not be taking into account as environmental cost? So I find the same kind of figure reproduced here. We just think we need to look closely at facts, and then we need to make choices. And there's no automatic link between the facts, which are also contested, and a certain regulatory choice. Now the second point, developing countries and GM crops. You've pointed out several facts about the use of GM crops in developing countries. Looking at the global scale, we have about 25 countries cultivating GM crops, and 15 of them are developing countries. You've also pointed out that this percentage may be growing in the future, but right now I think the situation is that the leading, probably also for some time to come, the leading firms commercializing GM crops are based in the developing countries. And they are also the ones that have intellectual property rights, for example, on GM crops. So I think there's a huge question of distribution involved here, and also of power between developing countries. So I would actually not agree with your point that you seem to make in your paper, at least, that GM crops should be more widely used in developing countries. I agree that hunger is a big issue. I think it's probably one of the biggest issues of our time, and it must be solved. I mean, definitely. But hunger is, I think, currently not, and probably also for some time to come, not a problem of not enough food being produced, but it's a problem of poverty and of access to food and of distribution. So I think when we're talking about solving this problem, we should look at solutions that are less controversial in their effects than GM crops, rather than using hunger as an argument in favor of GM crops. And when looking at the kind of solutions that are proposed, I would like to refer to the report of the IASTD, that is an acronym for International Assessment of Agricultural Knowledge, Science and Technology for Development. And I'm referring to this document because this is the outcome of a process in which more than 400 scientists were involved, and which also involved stakeholders all over the world. So this document, I think, can be taken as representing a pretty broad scientific and political consensus of where we should be heading with agriculture. And some of the conclusions that the report arrives, is that we need to increase yields and productivity in agriculture, but that this kind of increasing yields and productivity has in the past also had negative consequences on environmental sustainability. So it's not a good idea to increase yield by any means, but we need to carefully look at how this is done. A second point is that agricultural knowledge, science and technology should be strengthened, but it also says that this should be done in thorough, open, transparent engagement of all stakeholders, including small farmers, civil society, and I think this is something which is not, which doesn't match well with the current structure of the biotech industry. A third conclusion from the report is also that social scientists should be included in policy making in agriculture, and this relates back to what was said previously about, or what I said previously about the role of science in the regulatory decision making on GM. I think we need something that goes much beyond, natural science studies or studies just from any single discipline, but we need to have a broad societal process about GM crops. So these were basically the points I wanted to make. Thanks.
Thank you. Now, how much? Okay. So, David, if you want to spend a couple minutes responding, because probably there's some questions or comments from the audience.
Okay. That's spend probably a long couple, but I'll try. Okay. I think a lot of the points were valid, a lot of the points were not, and I'll respond. I agree. When you use Roundup Ready by the name, you use more Roundup. But Roundup is not that bad. And there will be resistance to Roundup, and there will be a solution. But altogether, with Roundup Ready, you have no tillage, and generally, the environmental effect of herbicides per se are not that problematic. So that is a true point. But altogether, I think the effect that you have no tillage and the fact that you have less soil erosion is something that overweight some of the negative effect. I think it's an illusion to think that a human will have a final solution to pest problem with innovation. There will be chemists at all the time, or biologists, or whoever, to develop new products. I think that the cycle of chemicals, I'm an economist, I'm not chemical, is unavoidable because we are in an evolution process that we play against nature, and everything, nature does something, we respond. Otherwise, we will sit all and lay in bed and do nothing. Now, with respect to the issue of yield effect, the yield effect argument, it's true, in the US there was no yield effect. I basically published a paper in Science, and by the way, none of this national thing never used a citation once of all these NGOs. They use generally citation of a referee journal. I have a paper that basically sent people to India, based on the assumption that there is no yield effect to BT cotton, and found 80% yield effect. The reason was, when you have a disease without a problem, GM will make a difference. If you have a disease without a pesticide, GM will make a difference. If you have a pesticide, it's a replacement. So I agree. In the US, the yield effect was very low. In the US, the yield effect was very low. Now, with respect to we don't have knowledge, never have perfect knowledge, but 1 million acres is quite a lot. So we learned something. The point is that it's obviously risky, but we have a lot of risk. The gentleman mentioned nuclear power. So we really have a lot of risk. Relative to other things, we know more and more. Now, now, in terms of corporate control, this is a problem, but we have corporate control on everything in life, and why start from seed? And I agree that there are a lot of mechanisms that allow more participation. See, GM is not Monsanto. But you cannot kill a technology because of a company. So to some extent, as I said before, I'm for organic and I'm for a lot of things, but GM is one of them. So I don't think that the issue of a company is a problem. Now, with respect to the other comments, I agree. The EU regulation is complex, and I could have spent all my time presenting them. But the reality is that there is a strong emphasis of on banning. The fact that someone does a study doesn't mean that we don't have knowledge. Now, there is a NRC study on the impact of GM crops, both economic and others. And one thing is clear to me is that at least as someone that does some of these studies, that the yield effect is not that big, because in many areas you suddenly increase the acreage and you were able to increase the agricultural production, especially in soybean, in an incredible amount of land that is not that fertile. So overall, the yield effect don't go up very much, but you have much more output, and you basically reduce the pressure in food markets. Now, it's true that distribution in food is a problem, but availability is also a problem. Last year, we didn't have a problem of distribution. We had a problem of availability. And if we add a little, let's say 10% more corn, we would have people dying in 80. So to some extent, we have a bad distribution system. We have to live with it. We can improve it. I'm for improving the distribution system, but it doesn't mean that we don't need to increase yields. Now, the issue of intellectual property right in developing countries is great. That's the reason, and I'm proud of it, that we started with PIPRA. That is, there is another group that's called ATF, African Technology Foundation. These are organizations that provide people that do research for small farmers, both money and intellectual property, so they are not dependent on corporations. So I am for GM, and at the same time I think that in Africa you need to develop infrastructure that it will be done locally. Now, the point that you mentioned about the Green Revolution, you are right. The Green Revolution introduced one variety to solve all the problem. With GM, you modify many existing varieties with the trait. So if you introduce the trait to every variety, you don't have a problem. If you introduce the trait to one variety, then you are in the same thing as the Green Revolution. So the potential to preserve biodiversity is there. Will it be done or not? It depends. In the US and China, it was done. In India, it was done. I worry in Africa that if we don't do it right, it would be done. That's the reason that I think we need to provide resources to people to develop technology for Africa, to farmers. And I'm not sure that this technology needs to be only GM. GM is to be part of the mix and not to be treated negatively more than anything else. With respect to the issue of scientists, all these other points are right. Communities should be involved. Social science is important, not only economics. But if you look at the overall effect, GM is not evil. It increases acreage, it increases provision of food. It has a lot of positive effect. And as I said before, in the beginning, if we say, God, we don't know anything about it, and we know everything about any other technology, I really think that we lose the tool of the most important discovery of the 20th century. We really don't take advantage of what we know about DNA. The reason that I feel strongly about it, that if the same people would have been 100 years ago, we wouldn't have electricity. I think we now have something that basically understands how the inner working of a biological system is, what is the inner working of biological system, and we have to take advantage of it with all the regulatory pressure. Finally, the formula that I presented is a basic formula that people that do precautionary principle are using. Namely, you maximize whatever is your objective subject to some risk standard, or minimize risk subject to some other constraints. The question is how you do it. The way it's done in many cases in Europe, the net effect is that you put the threshold in such a low level that the outcome will be always done. And it's not done in Europe, it's done in certain areas. Now, if scientists that are working in more or less rigorous frameworks will be together, I don't think that the views will be very far away from mine. Obviously, some will be more cautious than others. But I really think that we can have a dialogue that GMO can be applied at some reasonable level with some guarding. The current situation, when it cannot be applied at all, to me, is a little bit confusing. I really think that the people that pay here are not the US and Europe, they are people in developing countries.
Yeah, should we take some questions or 5 minutes of questions? Okay, so please approach the mic if you have a question. Please stand and talk into the microphone.
My name Dmitry Novik. Sorry that I missed presentation, but I see conclusions, and I agree with all 6 conclusions completely. And my opinion, I so thankful that I have some education, scientific education at this conference with this presentation. And blame science, greatest achievement of previous century, for inappropriate use by people, it's baloney. Science is science. It's science finalized with results. How you can use these results, it depends on the people. The same as nuclear energy.
Thank you.
And I'm so thankful for your presentation, and I enjoy, honestly.
Very good.
Can I respond to that?
Oh, please.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really important to understand that science is not just science. I mean, science doesn't implement itself in some vacuum. It takes place in a social setting. And Green Revolution, you know, it had problems, but it was run mostly by public sector scientists at you know, the CIMMYT in Mexico and the IRRI in the Philippines. And they were honestly working for the public interest, and they did achieve real clear, like double yields of major crops, all right? Now again, the way they did that has proven to be very problematic, but it was public sector driven. Biotech is almost totally a private sector effort. If you look at the genetically engineered crops that have been approved for use in the United States, 75 of them, there are 75 or 76 now, and only 3 of them were introduced by public sector institutions, and none of them are grown. I mean, this is completely, and Monsanto, you say Monsanto's not the biotech industry, and David, that's correct, but you know, currently they really do have a monopoly position with about 85 to 90% of the acreage of biotech crops attributable to the company's traits. So, you know, it's just important to recognize that fact, you know.
Do you use aspirin?
I'm not going to enter into this ideas. I'm not going to enter into Luddite discussions.
Let me raise another point and maybe leave it at, and maybe one more after that. So you put on your charts, your graph, something about the number of varieties, and I think it's important to distinguish between varieties and genetic diversity too. Those are not the same thing. I mean, I don't. You know, think of how many different kinds of varieties of breakfast cereal there are. So it's sort of, it would be more meaningful in that to show something about the germplasm diversity represented by those various different varieties.
The only point that I want to make is that the number of varieties didn't decline. Well, after the Green Revolution, the number of varieties declined.
Okay, but those varieties are not representative one-to-one with differences in genetic makeup.
No, I agree. There's no doubt. But the point is the GM basically would allow you to keep the varieties that you have and actually restore varieties that disappear. Green Revolution wasn't this way.
One last, we've got it. Go ahead.
Is this on?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, I have just a couple of brief points regarding the situation in Europe, etc. I mean, it's true what you comment, okay, that the situation is much more complex than the simple thing what David presented. But I think if you look in detail how it de facto works, it is actually that the European Commission proposals, okay, which have come out, which were based on the scientific evidence it had been looking at, based on the advice of the European Food Safety Authority, had been to liberalize the system, right? And it's the member states who blocked it based on political reasons. So de facto effect is exactly in the direction, I think, which David had indicated. The other thing on the concentration in the whole system, I understand, I mean, the whole debate, the whole Monsanto versus the potential benefits is so intertwined, I think, okay, and I understand very much the point you make. What I worry about the European standpoint is essentially that by basically restricting the development of biotech companies in Europe, you essentially allow the monopoly of Monsanto in the world. By basically, if there would be more investments in Europe, okay, there would be much less of a problem of a single company controlling the market. If you look, for example, what happened in China, there the government has massively invested in it. A number of companies has sprung up, and there the concentration, I mean, there's like 4 or 5 companies competing, for example, in cotton alone. And so also on the impact on the farm structure in developing countries, I mean, what we see now, and my institute has done a series of studies on it, the food safety and food quality requirements which Europe is imposing on its domestic production, but also on its imports, okay, is leading to very extensive vertical coordination and actually the demise of small farms for exports to Europe. Okay, it's actually the requirement that it's non-GMO, which implies all kinds of traceability requirements which none of the small farmers can satisfy. And therefore you've got vertical integrated production systems emerging all over Africa as a consequence of it. So I think the whole system is way more complex than just putting it.
Very good. Well, I think, all right, go ahead. Heidi's not here to tell us to turn it off, right?
I have just 3 quick comments. So, you know, hemp is such a resilient crop, and you know, rather than going to other measures, I'm just wondering about, you know, the implementation of a crop like hemp, crop diversification versus monoculture. In the book Biomimicry, and the work of Land Trust in the valleys here, where we've central United States, where we lost 3 feet of topsoil due to the monoculture approach. And the third comment is the secondary effects of Roundup and various pesticides and contaminated groundwater, et cetera, I think also needs to be considered. Thanks.
Right. Oh, there you are. Okay. Let's call this session to a close and give everybody our appreciation.
What years in those terms you're showing yielding? This is what I see. Location were referred to, or the years?
No, from last 4 years.
Where?
Globally.
Globally.
Absolutely.
Last 40 years, we know units.
Oh.
I mean, I'm sorry, I don't believe.
You're right.
I don't believe things like that.
No data.
And on pesticide use, you
No.
can't just write off. You know,
It has exactly the same name.
It's really this is the weeds. Weed scientists are saying we're going to be losing the glyphosate, which
I know.
is better than say it. And it's driving. This is
the good one.
Now, it's just
But the point is, I've been working with, I have so many papers on.
Oh, you don't want everyone
No.
to see it? Unfortunately, I don't know how to take it off the screen.
Okay.
So they're going to see that first slide. Sorry.
Never last.
Oh, that going to ruin it?
Yeah.
Let's see. Wonder what we can do.
No, I agree. No. But the point is it.
What do you want to try? Oh, maybe if we made it. Okay.
They don't know.
Okay.
They don't.
you know, the linkage of seed to a particular that's what
Do we have it here? Did someone load it? We're just
The name of my presentation is Rivers of Diversity.
Ah, that's what
maybe
she might have
she made
named
a
it.
folder. Yeah. Okay. And you have.
Right. I
Yeah.
think it'll ask me, do I want
Yeah.
to replace?
Yeah,
Yes.
and that's fine. Oh, thanks. Yes.
Yes, we do.
Okay, and then we. Okay. What I will do now is it. Yeah. Can I?
Well, let's.
Or not.
Is that okay?
Yeah, it's that one. It's that one on the desktop.
Okay.
Oh, yes? Please. Okay. So you'll start first.
I don't know if this one is.
Yeah, exactly.
Is it the good one?
I don't know.
Okay, so we will put this and back to
There we go. Yes.
I'm not sure yet what I'm going to say. So.
I know. So that's what I'm going to say then.
and I will do this. Okay, then it's.
Ah. Okay. Good. This is a remote too. Oh, that's for you.
starting? Are we here? Hello. Hello, let's call it to order, so to speak. We all here? Okay. My name is Mike Telson, and I'm pleased to introduce this panel, to chair the discussion of this panel, on an extremely important topic. Hi. Topic at the heart of economics, the economy, natural resources, and water is just it's amazing. For other than a natural resource economist, it's true. You just sell it to the highest bidder. It doesn't quite work that way, as we all know. And focusing, Gabriel below will be talking about focusing on these issues from a river perspective. And we're very fortunate to have a panel of authorities and people who have actually done this and worked in this and fought the battles in this for many years, who can give you all the details. First, Bob Wilkinson will talk from UC Santa Barbara. Second, Tam Dodik, who's now chair of the State Water Resources Control Board.
Actually, no longer chair.
Well, then you're very happy.
Yes, thank you.
And you can talk more freely.
And I can talk more freely, yes.
And last, Gerald Secundi, who's president of the California Council for Environmental and Economic Balance. Gabrielle, would you begin?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm very pleased to present this paper on the behalf of Matt Condolf and myself. Unfortunately, Matt cannot be with us today, but to mitigate your disappointment of not being able to see him, I have brought some pictures of him. So where you can see that our approach is based on field experience and based on, well, real practical and concrete experience. Well, we have been interested in the relationship between aquatic biodiversity and water rights. You may know that aquatic and riparian areas are hot spots for biodiversity, and the biodiversity that is fitted to natural flow patterns is the biodiversity that has been shaped by historical geological times, and when water diversion by man was really little or inexistent. And so the principal threats on biodiversity once pollution is treated remains water diversion. So as climate changes, restoration may demand that existing water rights be challenged or be modified, and reallocation of water is the main issue for water restoration or watercourse restoration. What is interesting in California and the European Union is that in these entities, there are leeway for adaptation in their water regulations. So that was the basis for our comparison between both. You may say that to compare California with the entire European Union is an unexpected comparison because usually American states are compared to other states, nation states, and not the, well, a sort of union that is even not a federal union at the European level. But as far as rivers are concerned, comparison between California and the entire European Union is really relevant, and I will tell you why. Both entities have faced similar challenges. First of all, from the point of view of the landscapes, although there is a big difference in terms of space and acreage between the two entities, the diversity of landscapes is similar, having elevation from 80 meters below sea level to 4,000 above, having deserts, having humid temperate forests. Well, the diversity within California is similar to the diversity you can observe in the entire European Union. Then the diversity of impacts have been also similar. Both entities have faced massive industrialization, inducing huge losses in ecological habitats. But probably most importantly, both entities have faced a diversity of strong political oppositions. And it's true for California as well as the European Union that they are struggling with the presence of powerful core of water engineers. They are struggling with, or they are dealing with, subsidized irrigation, which has a very huge impact on the river. They have both limited budget for environmental policies. Well, we can say they have limited budget in any field, but specifically in environmental policies. And we could imagine that they will rely on a sort of counter-expertise or counterpower with environmentalists. But what is interesting is to see that their ecologists are divided. It's true in California that people striving for a better quality of life when they are settling in polluted areas, when there are workers struggling against their employers, well, they have little to share with ecologists who are fighting for wilderness. So the internal divide between ecologists in California is strong, and the internal divide between ecologists, northern ecologists and southern ecologists within Europe is also a big divide. So there is no big coalition of environmentalists, I think, or it has been a challenge to get those divide, or to overcome this divide in both entities. Well, I'm sorry, yeah. Well, this is just one example about the diversity of impacts they have been facing. This is a picture of the gold rush, where we see that as soon as California joined the federal union, major diversion of water have been used to mine for mining. Another element is that now we're comparing the European Union and California, and because of this diversity of stakes California and the European have, what we can see as far as California is concerned is that water rules are conflicting. There is no clear-cut doctrine of water allocation in California, as opposed to, for example, the Colorado water doctrine, which is much more clear-cut. It's because there is an opposition between the riparian doctrine, which holds that the riparian owner has an impaired right to the natural water flow, even if now, by constitution, it is subjective to reasonableness. Nevertheless, there is another doctrine, which is the prior appropriation doctrine, which shows that water users should have a beneficial use of their water, otherwise they may lose their right. And there are other doctrines like the Pueblo rights, which give priority to urban uses, and also to a limited scope, the public trust doctrine is also coming into account. So between those 3 or 4 doctrines, water users in California has always a threat that their rights might be challenged. And there are other challenges because there are additional rights at the federal level, rights for water users in terms of quality. So the Clean Water Act designated uses that should be protected, and Endangered Species Act protected species that shouldn't be taken. Ironically, main users in California are federal agencies. So California is also a big spot for feds struggles or internal struggles. This competition of rights creates room for adaptation. So historically, in the paper, we have studied the evolution of this regulation and its interpretation, and we can see that it has been the tensions between legislature and courts managed to create room for adaptation. In the European case, historically, state had a great discretion in allocating water rights. So historical rights have been allocated by lords because they had a sort of strategy to trade their allegiance. And then later, after the revolution, to take France as an example, state engineers have been the main actors defining what public utility is. And this is also based on a great amount of discretion of this court. And another feature of those member states' discretion in allocating water rights is that there are little binding environmental quality standards within member states in the European Union. So what the EU does is that it creates no rights for individuals, but it imposes performance of member states. So somebody said before that some country may ratify treaties even if they cannot implement them. Well, in the case of the European Union, a lot of requirements of the European Union actually rest on the implementation of member states. The EU creates environmental quality standards and ecological quality standards, and also economic standards like cost recovery. And asking for reports, it creates also information that is now available for the public, so that is also a way to empower the public. But mainly, it is a place for, a place to challenge existing rights. So, because the implementation is the duty of member states, the fact that EU laws may conflict with existing water rights is something the EU doesn't care about, and it should be addressed by member states. So the EU has become a political arena for environmentalists. Now, comparing both regulation and to come to the point about what can California and the EU learn from each other, and to come to recommendations, we thought within this project that there are similarities between the California and US laws and EU laws that can underscore the difference and what one could learn from each other. First, there is a similarly target on efficiency that is quite interesting to see. The fact that cost-benefit analysis are a requirement under Californian and US law, and also in the EU laws, the fact that the use that are accepted or authorized should be beneficial. There's a similar requirements, and that is a similar challenging requirements. Both laws, or both set of laws, may empower the civil society by through the means of consultation under CEQA, for example, in California, and through mandatory reporting under the EU. But there, I would like to stress a difference that I think very important. Under California and US laws, the protection of a good environment has been mainly enforced under ESA, which is by some really considered as a very stringent and difficult rule to deal with, because unflexible, because of its lack of flexibility. But I would like to say that one strength of this law, and especially when you implement it in California and you look at the jurisprudence in California, the strength of this law is that it speaks to the public. Flagship species are really something that people can understand, and can understand what a biodiversity loss mean in terms of flagship species. Whereas under EU law, and especially the Water Framework Directive, the quality of the environment, and especially the ecological quality, is specified by metrics. And those metrics do not speak at all to the general public. And so there is a lack of public participation to this process because, well, it is really technocratic. But on the other side, under the EU law, the EU requires member states to monitor much more data about the ecology and the environment than US and Californian laws do. And that means that the burden of monitoring do not rest on claimants and victims, but rather is a cumulative process, and the public has access to a series of data that have been implemented from the beginning under the EU law, that have been also standardized and made comparable between member states. So even if this data are calibrated under metrics, the availability, the comparability between this data and the accessibility to this data is secured under the EU law. Then last, maybe, well, maybe I can skip that, and we may go back to it if needed during the debate. But I would like to stress the fact that comparing the legislation and rules between California and the EU, we found there's critical pieces of law based on flagship species and unnegotiable environment, so to say. The fact that the more efficient rule for challenging water rights has been the ESA and the US law and in California. It's really interesting to look at in the perspective of climate change. Dealing with the diversity made California and the EU quite adaptive without clear-cut doctrines, because then it allowed them to challenge existing water rights. And those bodies, California and the EU, have been able to reallocate water, and that is really, I think, something we will have to do under climate change. But what is interesting to see is that to preserve biodiversity under climate change and to curtail water rights, we have to fight against strong economic stakes who would like to maintain the status quo, and to challenge those economic interests. We need the public, we need constituency, and without the understanding of the public of what is at stake, and especially through species that can be, tractable or understandable, we won't have an ecological radical critique that is needed to achieve this reallocation. Of course, that is part of the job to redefine what is natural variability, but so to keep to our two recommendations, I would say, do not sacrifice sentinels or flagship species on the grounds of inescapable climate change, because those sentinels or flagship species are exactly what can lead to public participation. To get rid of them would mean to get rid of public participation and an acceptance to irretrievable biodiversity losses. The other recommendation is do not let the burden of environmental monitoring on the claimants and victims. Take the example of the EU to have an accessibility on data that is publicly funded. I'm done.
Okay, thanks. Bob?
Okay, thank you. You covered a great deal of turf on this, and so can you hear me okay? Close enough to it? So we'll pick out a few things to try to talk about. The three of us know each other. We've been involved in a dialogue in California for a number of years on environmental policy, and so we
don't necessarily like each other, but we know each other.
So I was elected by Jerry to lead off, so let me do that. And I'm taking my cue from the statement in the brochure and the materials that you sent out, that we're looking at concrete, actionable policy recommendations, further regulatory cooperation and so forth, which I find a very exciting opportunity. So that's the way I'm going to try to enter into this. let me start with just a quick personal note. About 20 years ago, this year, the wall came down in Europe. And I had the chance the following year to go over for a couple of years and help start a new university and a graduate program in environmental science and policy. And at that time, all of the Central European countries were completely rewriting all of their laws, including all their environmental laws. And I'm reflecting on that as I read this paper and thought about how Dr. Below sees the California experience in history, and she went through a lot of it with the water doctrines and so forth. I'll comment on just briefly. And it's interesting to see how one looks at a system kind of from the outside and then compares it. And I'll jump to my closing thought is I, for one, have a lot more to learn about some of the European legal experience and history that I think we collectively could learn from in California. The one thing that you didn't bring out in your presentation, but you did strongly in the paper that I wanted to tag, is the one best way approach. And that is essentially an indictment of narrow thinking that tends to self-reinforce within certain groups. And we certainly had the same experience. A colleague of mine wrote a book called Battling the Inland Sea. Some of you may know Bob Kelly, an historian. And the same kind of issue with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers with particular ways to do things and other options are off the table, and the need to step back and look at what else we might do. In the paper, you focus on doctrines, legal doctrines. For those of you not steeped in this language, a doctrine is a set of ideas that provides a basis for what's good and right and appropriate in a system. And I found it interesting that you went to and set forth accurately, I think, the range of doctrines. We actually started with the Pueblo Doctrine. It's not just cities versus ag, by the way, but it was the basis on the Pueblos that were adjacent to the missions in California under Spanish law. And the key point for that, we in Santa Barbara actually have Pueblo water rights for the city, as does Los Angeles, San Diego, a few cities have these. Was adopted from a Mediterranean climate, more similar to California than the riparian doctrine, and it included provisions for during shortage, everybody needs to find a way to sort that shortage out together. That's important because that logic translated through from Europe to California, and we adopted that in 1848 as part of the treaty with Mexico. To their chagrin, the same year that gold was discovered. So, and then the following year, 1850, we adopted a constitution, created a state out of a territory, and adopted British common law, pretty much whole cloth, as did most other U.S. states, and we picked up the riparian doctrine. So now we have two competing doctrines, one grandfathered, one in the official state constitution, and of course that worked very well for a rainy place where there was virtually no irrigation and water was used for transportation and energy purposes. Perhaps not so well in California's climate. In the intervening year, 1849, we invented our own without the benefit of long cultural history and how to get along. So ours was brilliantly set up, the appropriative doctrine, first in time, first in right, and use it or lose it. A very sustainable system for water management, not. And so, and of course, other Western states adopted the appropriative doctrine and let the other ones go, so they took it whole cloth. As did New Zealand, Australia, as they had their gold rushes, they picked up California logic on this law as well. With very mixed results. Because now we're to the point where, as you mentioned in your paper, users will use the water whether they have good use for it or not, because if they don't use it, they lose it. At least that's been a governing logic. One quibble I'd have with you on the paper is that you seem to give us a heck of a lot more credit for paying attention to efficiency of water use than we deserve. And I would argue that we have a long way to go, and in fact our institutions and legal structures are working against efficient use, whether you're using a technical definition of efficiency or an economist optimality kind of approach. We're far from it, and a big part of what we need to do is figure out how to use water more efficiently in order to meet urban needs and ag needs and restore ecosystems and species and so forth. You put the focus on flows in natural systems in this biodiversity discussion. I think that's very helpful because a lot of us quickly go to water quality issues and so forth, but to step back and say, well, if there's not water in the system, there is some speculative research that fish do need water. It of course needs more funding, but it looks like maybe that there's some merit to that. And so I think you nailed something in terms of how we think about these trade-offs and how we have developed our rights system. In the U.S., water rights, the right to use water, is one of the reserved rights to the state, as it wasn't explicitly given to the federal government. According to our Constitution, it's a states' rights issue. So actually, and it's a question of language, I think, semantics in your presentation. When we talk about water rights, they're not water rights at the federal level, but they are water policies like the ESA and Clean Water Act and so forth, which affect water use. And essentially, as I see it, what these laws, this evolving notion of competing values and the fact that ecosystems and species have value and need to be protected, is not eliminating water rights. In the Audubon case you cite from Mono Lake, what the courts ruled and the state board was not that LA lost its right. It constrained the exercise of its right. And more that is really what's at stake. It's okay, there is a usufruct right for water under these different doctrines and systems, but they're increasingly being constrained by other measures. And that fourth major doctrine that just came into play in California in the last couple of decades is the public trust doctrine. But of course, it's the most ancient. It goes back to Justinian and Roman law. And it, interestingly, limits the right of a sovereign, in this case the state, to give up something that is ultimately a trust responsibility. That's an area, I think, for rich potential future research and understanding. How has this notion of the role of the sovereign, which, as you point out in France, has been a totally different history of water management for different reasons and evolved in different ways, how does that logic of trust responsibilities, which has been extended in our litigation and now case law in California, to environmental systems, how does that evolve? What can we learn from other systems that have found ways to be potentially more sustainable in water management? Maybe not perfect, but some other methods than what we've got in California. Really, our water policy until the last couple decades is not policy, but it's an artifact of disputes over water rights. So for all that time, until at least the 60s, I'd say, 50s to 60s, it was really a question of who got the rights. But whatever happened after that, it was fully legal to completely dry out a creek or a river. We've done it all the way up to the Colorado River. It doesn't reach the ocean, but done to many rivers and streams in California. The second major river in California is the San Joaquin River, according to the textbook. It's dry for about 40 miles. So it's not a major river by any reasonable definition anymore. Unimpaired flows it would be, but it's not. So we actually have systems that have allowed and facilitated this complete dewatering systems with huge impacts. And this whole process now, as I see it, is going back to reaching a different kind of balance, which Jerry will take care of because he's in charge of balance with seed. Just a couple other quick comments, and I'll stop here. Restoration in California, and I don't mean back to some pristine state, but restoring ecosystem functions and certain attributes, is very much the driver now for policy, as I think, as you point out in the paper in cases in Europe, where the Mono decision and now also on the Owens system is restoring at least some level, lake level ecosystem function. In the Klamath River to the north, we're looking at almost certainly, I would submit, removal of some dams. All the studies have said much cheaper than try to keep them in place. We're looking at restoration issues in the San Francisco Bay Delta system and so forth throughout the state. And our legal structure is not well designed to facilitate long-term sustainable management of restored systems. We're still much in the mode of who gets what and who's in priority. But TAM's going to fix that because that's the state board responsibility for water rights. Let me stop there. I think what we'd like to do is maybe make some comments, but then have more time to go back and forth. And I know we're already over time, so I'm going to hold the rest of my comments here and move to TAM.
Great.
Tam, you're going to fix it, right?
Oh, definitely. As soon as Bob tells me how. He's the academic. Let me begin with a disclaimer. One of the things that's so nice about not being chair of the State Water Board anymore is that I can speak more freely, but I have to do that with a disclaimer that my statements are my own and are not reflective of the entire board, nor is it reflective of the governor and the administration, especially since I'm about, I think, to later on in my remarks make some pretty inflammatory statements. So with that, the disclaimer is up there. I also want to thank you for the paper. I thought it was very well done in terms of outlining the development and the challenges that we have in terms of water rights and water quality in California. I think you're right on in terms of talking about the challenges that are associated with resources, lack of information, which is so critical for us, and just the challenges of, and Bob has already mentioned some of the riparian versus PEBO versus doctrines that we have and how we manage that conflict in California. And the only, I think, area where I would caution you on is your emphasis on the ESA, the Environmental and the Endangered Species Act. The ESA is indeed a very powerful tool, but it's not the only tool. It's not the only tool for addressing water issues in California, and it's definitely not the only tool for ensuring public participation. In fact, we have many other laws, CEQA, being one, for example, the California Environmental Quality Act, upon which we are continually struggling to try to comply with in order to move forward on our environmental protection issues. And public participation is a mandate on all of us, on Joan's department as well as my own. And so I would caution you again, it's a matter of semantics, but in terms of emphasizing, or putting too much emphasis on ESA to the extent of excluding other tools that we have now in our tool chest. The other areas that I thought you did extremely well on is your pointing out of the value and the difference that society makes, especially societal preferences, how that could affect different interpretation of laws, implementation of laws, how that could empower civil society and change. I was just reading the last issue of The Economist, and they basically said the same thing in terms of water use. Well, one of the things they said was water use. One of the biggest factors that affect water use is not the size of the population, but the habits and the diets of the population. So societal difference really is a key, and I think you point that out very well in your paper. Where I think I wish you had explored more, and perhaps this is outside of the scope of the project in the paper, and better discussed in terms of future areas, is, let me go back. In your introductory paragraph, you made a very compelling statement about that the threats to our environment, to species will be severe if the regulations that we established in the past can't change to adjust to the emerging challenges that we have. And while you made that statement at the start and you outlined all the challenges and all the tools, I felt that the paper lacked that next step, that compelling argument as to what we did, why it was or was not effective, and where do we go from here, and how do we create that impetus for change. And I say that given, well, I want to give a little bit of back history. In 1993, I was actually on the staff of the State Water Board as an engineer working in the Bay Delta program. And we were working on, what else but a plan to fix the Delta. And I learned from Michael Hanneman today that we actually utilized a study that he had worked on in the 80s. And when I left the board in 1995 as staff, the board had just adopted a 1995 water quality control plan for the Delta. I returned to the board as a board member in 2005, and things had gone to heck in a basket in the Delta. And yet, and Jerry was on the board then, our staff came to us, and they were doing an update to the Bay Delta plan, and the recommendation to the board was, we can't make any changes. We can't make any changes because we didn't have the information, because we're not sure how, fixing this will create a problem here. In other words, what the staff proposed, and that Jerry and I most reluctantly voted for, was basically the same plan in 1995, carried over to 2005. Yes, it is Jerry's fault. With the direction that we will revisit this plan and make corrections and updates as we proceed. And that is where we are today in 2008. We've started a process at the Water Board to, again, working with the Delta Vision Committee's report and the other efforts to develop yet another Bay Delta plan. And my frustration, this is where the inflammatory comments come in, my frustration is, given everything that has gone wrong in the Delta. I think everything that's gone wrong in California when it comes to water management and water rights, what is the incentive that is, what is that critical tipping point to make us change and actually do something different than what we've done all along in maintaining the status quo? So I guess what I was hoping to get from your paper was that, that magic, here's what we have to do differently because here's, what went wrong in the past. So I think you were perhaps too kind, as Bob said, in your evaluation of how we have addressed the efficiency factor in California. I certainly feel like Bob does, that we have not even begun to address it at all. And one of the things that, and Jerry's going to love this, because one of the things that we discussed was that Jerry's going to respond to my comments. And of course, I didn't tell him what I was going to say. But one of the things that I think we need to do a better job on, and this is where, there's going to be plenty of room of dialogue between the regulators, the industry, and the university, is this area of water value, of the value of water. And I'm going to quote Michael Henneman here because he's in the room. At least this quote was attributed to you, and it was told to me. And that I think you were quoted as saying there are two categories of economic value: water and everything else, which I wholeheartedly agree with. And yet we really don't have a way of valuing water through whatever historical practices that have gone in the past. And so I think our challenge, or at least my recommendations to you in terms of moving ahead as a group, is looking at how do we create a new market vision for water. And what do we have to identify what are the regulatory, legislative, legal, cultural, equity issues and hurdles that we have out there in order to do it. How do we move and change the status quo? How do we encourage more recycle and conservation and stormwater capture and reuse, all of the things that we need to work in partnership with universities and with industry on. And perhaps one of the things that we need to do is to revisit this issue of water rights. I know this is a sacred cow, and this is another inflammatory statement, but what is a water right? If you think about it, it's absolutely fictional. It's a piece of paper that really, and people will go to court and fight to the death for their water rights, but it is completely fictional. And in the future, in 10, 20 years from now, it will be gone. It will be over. Thank you. And it is, however, the status, the current status, the perception of water rights, and it's mine, and you can't take it, and I get to use it, and the conflict that creates with public trust doctrine. And then you have regulatory agencies such as mine who are caught in the middle. There are those who really want to do the right thing with respect to the public trust, yet we're caught in this maddening dilemma of not having information, the resources, or the political will to actually make the decisions that we need to make in order to move ahead. And my challenge to you, to all of us sitting here, is I don't know what it takes to take us beyond the current system that we have here, recognizing that what we have currently does not work very well, and that the challenges that are coming are way beyond anything that we can't even imagine right now when it comes to the economy, when it comes to climate change. How do we take advantage of that and make a change beyond the current status quo that we currently have? So Jerry, respond to that.
Let me intervene there. Now I see what you meant by inflammatory.
Yes.
You got to the point, and obviously you're a communist, so we'll come back to you later.
I'd say that's a fair label, actually. So. Just to clear up any confusion, Tam is no longer the chair of the State Water Resources Control Board, but she is a member of board. There are only 4 members currently. She is one of the 4 members and very, very powerful. And just so you know, for 2 years, I was the vice chair of the Water Board when Tam was the chair of the Water Board, so that's how we know each other so well. I represent a group called the California Council for Environmental and Economic Balance that was founded in 1973 by our former governor, Pat Brown, and it was an organization that's nonpartisan, nonprofit, and was bringing together business, labor, public figures that had interest in the environment, as well as ex-members of the legislature. And these days, we even include environmentalists in some of our projects so that we can deal with them. We have two mantras. One is things should be cost effective, and the other is that they should be technologically feasible. They seem rather radical, but we continue to push those even in front of the Water Board. I am actually a D.C. native. I grew up in Washington, D.C. in Northeast at 25th and Benning Road and went to school at Charles Young Elementary School. And not in Maryland, not in Virginia, but in D.C. itself, I want you to know. But I've lived in California since 1972 and have found out that it's a somewhat different culture. On the business side, I represent some fairly small, innocuous, humble companies such as Exxon, Shell, BP, SoCal Edison, Sempra, PG&E. But we also have Disney and Universal Studios and Cisco and AT&T and something called GM, if GM still exists anyway, and railroads, et cetera. So frankly, most of the major industries in California. And I guess the best way to give you kind of a feel for those of you that are not from California as to how industry is viewed is not too many years ago, and forgive me because I've told my colleagues this story before, I was dealing with a senior attorney at NRDC, a very, very brilliant woman who'd been educated at Stanford and Berkeley, et cetera, and who was railing against the oil industries. And I worked for Atlantic Richfield 28 years, and so I said, hey, have you ever been to a refinery? And the answer is no, never been to a refinery, wouldn't want to do that. Well, finally I persuaded her to go to a refinery, and as we entered the refinery, she's kind of in hip boots, if you like, and she looks down at my shoes and sees these thin-soled Italian loafers and says, well, where are your boots? I said, what do you mean, where are my boots? She says, well, don't you need boots to walk through here? I said, well, why would you need boots? Well, how are we going to get through all the oil? And her concept of the refinery is that we would be marching through puddles of oil on the ground. So we went from one portion of the refinery to the next. You can eat off the floor in any modern refinery. There is no oil on the ground. If there's oil on the ground, there's a major, major problem. You know, oil companies like oil in the pipes because that's how they make money. They have no desire to waste it, and not to mention the fact that there'd be a few environmental problems if we did something like that. It is such a rich field, I hardly know where to start in terms of just the challenges. But first, in the paper itself, I thought it was an excellent paper. But by and large, water rights, if you like, and water allocation is fairly well settled in California. If you want to achieve a water right in California, unless things have changed since I left the board, you file a petition and you wait 10 years, and then maybe your petition would be...
I'm sorry, 20 years or more.
Oh, 20 years or more, I'm sorry. Didn't mean to underestimate. So it's not an active field. Everything the Water Board does, about 90% is water quality, which you can say / water supply to a large extent, and the other 10% is water rights. So the action, if you like, has really moved beyond the water rights, water allocation, and we are dealing with many of the problems that we have in terms of water quality. And I'll just mention a few of them and some of the problems that we have with them, and the struggles that we have, not frankly with the Water Board so much, but with the environmental community and from an industry point of view. The mercury TMDL, our total maximum daily load, anytime you have an impacted water body, under our current regulations, you would also have a TMDL as to how much pollutant you can put in that water body and still maintain its beneficial use, however that beneficial use is designated. Well, in San Francisco Bay, there's about 60,000 kilos of mercury sitting on the bottom of the bay itself. And this is a legacy from the mining that went on. I think we heard about that earlier. And we have about 1,000 kilos a year that continue to wash into the bay from the various streams, the old mines, if you like, that have been closed down, but frankly, still aren't sealed up, so that continues to come into the bay. So the emphasis from the environmental community, and Tam, correct me if I'm wrong, had really been on industry in terms of chemical plants and refineries, who produce somewhere between 12 and 17 kilos a year. And I think Tam and I both agreed that let's look at the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room was cleaning up what was already in the bay and cleaning up what was washing in from the various streams, as opposed to trying to squeeze industry even more from 12 pounds down to 10 pounds or something of that effect. Again, back to cost effective. And again, that's what we push. Stormwater. Stormwater is probably, in my opinion, one of our biggest problems and one of our biggest opportunities. We don't need water from Northern California, we who live in Southern California, if indeed we could capture the stormwater that comes every winter. We don't have storage systems that are large enough to do that. We don't have, frankly, permeable surfaces that can capture that stormwater and have it go into the ground itself. You need what are called spreading fields. Those of you that are not steeped in water lore. And spreading fields is simply an open field that hasn't been paved over with concrete or asphalt or something like that. So if you have those, you can recharge the groundwater, and you can use that groundwater for your needs in Southern California. Tam is saying, what's going to happen with the Delta? What's going to tip the balance? How are we going to have new thinking? Well, I think one of the ways we're going to have new thinking is climate change. As the Delta becomes more salient, we are not going to be able to get the water from Northern California because it's frankly going to be useless. So we're going to have to rely more and more upon our homegrown water, and we can do that. We can do that through water capture, water recharge. We can do that through conservation. We can do that through more efficiency in our water usage. There's no reason we can't live on what we have currently. Now, I won't mention the city of San Francisco, which steals all of its water from Hetch Hetchy, even though they rail against Southern California taking.
But they're disadvantaged.
Oh, they're disadvantaged. It's a disadvantaged community. That's what we're told. But that's where we need to go, I think, as a society. We need to look at our current usage and how we can, frankly, decrease that through conservation and better usage. So stormwater, I think, is a great example of being able to do that. But there's another part of that in terms of stormwater discharge. When stormwater is discharged, it is polluted because it has run through parking lots or underground vaults or even farms, et cetera, and it's rushing off into the LA River, which is really just a concrete channel, and it's quite polluted. So one of the things that's a huge challenge is trying to figure out what type of quality that stormwater should achieve as it's running off your particular property. If you look at a refinery again, it's very easy because refineries capture all of the stormwater within berms within the refinery. It's treated and then released. But a Walmart parking lot is a much more problematic situation. How are you going to capture that? And how do you measure what's clean and not clean? And if the storm comes at 3 o'clock in the morning, how are you measuring it? One of the things that they're looking at are numeric limits. There has to be a finite limit as to what can be discharged. Well, at what point? Is it when the storm first hits? Is it 3 hours later? Is it the next day? At what point of the parking lot do you measure it? Things of that nature. Very complex. Other challenges that we have, and then I'll probably leave you with this and open up this discussion, which is once through cooling. And I'd be very fascinated to talk to some of the European colleagues here as to what we're doing. We currently have 19 power plants up and down the coast of California that represent about 40% of the power in California, the electrical generation power. These plants are cooled by once-through cooling. It takes in seawater and then cools the process and discharges that seawater back into the ocean through long pipes that disperse it. So there's really not a huge temperature problem. The problem is one of marine life as to how much damage is being done to the aquatic life itself. The intake valves have screens on them that are supposed to trap most of this life at this point in time. But the screens trap a lot of larvae and destroy them, and also very small minnows. Now, despite what you may have heard, we don't capture seals, whales, and other things because the screens are only 3/8 inches in size, so it's very, very unusual to get anything trapped in that's much larger than that. But what do we do with that? Well, currently, the State Water Board is looking at how can I put it, regulating these particular power plants and seeing if they can't be changed in terms of their cooling systems. One of the challenges that the State Water Board will have is, in order to change that, they'll need either a dry cooling system or a wet cooling system, or they need to shut down the plant itself. Those two items, a dry or wet cooling system, have their own environment problems. Number one, is there land next to the current plant that you can acquire in order to put in large towers? Number two, to the people that live near there, will they sue? Not in my backyard. Number three, can you get emission credits in terms of air pollution in order to put in these towers? Or should you be looking at other things such as restoration? If indeed there is damage to the marine environment at that point in time, maybe it would behoove us to take a look at creating new wetlands for more aquatic life in nearby areas as opposed to trying to, quote, fix the problem of the cooling towers themselves. So these are just some of the examples that we are dealing with on a daily basis. They go on and on. I haven't even gotten into things like ASBSs, our areas of special biological significance in California. You are not allowed to put any discharge in these. These are marine aquatic areas up and down the coast. If you have a farm and there's runoff into the ocean, you must stop that. If you have a city that's right on the ocean, you cannot discharge anything into them. And by anything, I mean literally under the law, one molecule cannot go into that. You're talking hundreds of millions of dollars in diversion in order not to go into these particular areas. And I don't think Tam would particularly agree by just diverting it 2 feet in front of the area of special biological significance and then letting it merge in. So you have to capture it and treat it also. So huge challenges in California. We are talking of billions and billions of dollars that have to be spent in order to do this. So let me turn it back over to Dr. Wilkinson.
Actually, I'll make one real quick comment on process and then turn it back to our chair. You just heard from a representative of California industry, I think it'd be fair to say. The people that
I was only
decided-
representing industry this time.
The little family-owned companies like Chevron's. And I think a passionate and genuine statement about stormwater, and actually some of the companies that he represents are doing some world-class activity. Toyota, for example, capture on roofs and parking lots in Southern California and Torrance and so forth. So there's a real commitment and activity behind some of what he's saying. I find this interesting from a process standpoint for the purpose of this meeting, which is what might we learn from European Union and countries and processes in Europe and trade back and forth. And the process, this dialogue between business, government, environment, others, to think about the art of the possible, the potential for solving problems versus the predictable fights, strikes me as a rich opportunity. And I'm sure we've spent some time, and Jerry and I have actually done tours, a meeting with folks in Europe, the comparable processes going on in Europe. I think we've got a lot to learn from the process of dialogue about issues and setting regulations and so forth, as well as digging in on the science of each one of those questions. So I'd suggest that as well in terms of what we might think about for follow-on activities.
Bob, okay.
Let me just add to that, and then I'll hush up. I would very much welcome that. We have no monopoly on brilliance, if you like, in California. We would love to see what the solutions are in Europe. You are tackling many of the same problems we are. What is your approach to them? Again, are they cost-effective and technologically feasible? What can we learn from you? I would love to have that dialogue.
And if everyone's jumping in, let me jump in with one request. From a regulatory perspective, I would love to learn from Europe. The best way to achieve successful outcomes, is it through the regulatory hammer or is it through partnership and collaboration? The issue of stormwater has come up, and you've heard from Jerry that obviously there's a great deal of appreciation and recognition that we, through low-impact development and other tools, should be capturing and reuse some of our stormwater runoff. And the Water Board has a draft permit out right now, which I can't hear you talking about because I'm under ex parte prohibition, but that requirement is an actual regulatory permit that has LID requirements in it. Is it out yet, or it will be out soon? I think I just let the bunny out of the hat. It will be out soon. And so I expect that the board will get a lot of comments about this should not be regulated. This should be something that is done on a voluntary basis. And so what I'm interested in learning is through the experiences in Europe, how do you tread that tightrope and create that balance and successfully use the regulatory hammer to incentivize and yet create a productive partnership with industry in order to be successful?
We don't have a lot of time left. We got about 15 minutes, I guess. So I'd like to give Gabrielle some time to respond, and then we'll go for the audience.
Oh, thank you. I will not answer all the comments, and I think a lot of comments can just be taken into account like this. But just to come back to the point concerning the water rights that are more fictional than real. I think our study of the history of water rights in Europe shows that there were also paper rights in Europe. And before, to take France as an example, before the French Revolution, some individuals had rights that were confirmed by paper, Lord's paper, and what the revolution performed was that it at the very same time, it challenged those rights through a quest of efficiency, but at the same time, it grounded those paper rights in something more real than they actually are. That means that it's secure through dams, building, and etc., the perception that those rights were much more real than what they were before. And based on those papers, the revolution say, okay, those guys had the right. Actually, they didn't. They had a right that was submitted before to the availability of water. But this was not included in the way the revolution based its assumption. And so there was the same, let's say, race to secure much more rights than actually existed before. And I think we can observe this also in the US and especially in California. So the way the state gained its legitimacy was mainly in terms of water, based on the fact that it could afford or offer much more water than before. So the public, under the public utility and public interest, the state provide much more water than before, but it also strengthened rights much more than before. And I think the challenge under climate change is to say, okay, but all those rights, and even the rights that were grounded before the French Revolution, they were not, sacred or really, they were not stones. They were submitted and subjected to constraints before, and we have to come back to these constraints because as the climate is changing, shortages are going to be much frequent than before. So let's not consider them as stronger than they are actually. And the role of the EU is to say, well, not the role of the EU, but the way the EU perform is to say, I don't want to know those papers about water rights. That is not my problem. You have to adjust by yourself and achieve performance that is ecologically founded. And so this is quite a thing, actually, and member states are really helpless, actually. Or what I see in France is that they're struggling to achieve this ecological status or standards through the one best way of offering more water, but it doesn't work anymore. So now if you are not able to see what are the outcomes or the solution we can provide in Europe, it's because it's an ongoing process, and the directives that have been adopted are quite recent. So we are still in a very recent and new process. I would like also to say that the main difference between California and a lot of European states, not all, but a lot of, is codification. So the states that have been colonized by Napoleon have laws are codified. So that means that there is the responsibility of the states to allocate water. So the fact that water rights may change, well, it's just that to say that the importance of doctrine to interpret how to constrain or to allocate water is very different in California and in the Europeans, because the role of the state is really different. But what allows me and Matt to do the comparison is the fact that this role of the states and member states is somehow overpassed or overcome by the EU, which doesn't take this into account to define what should be the performance.
Okay. I assume Louisiana is a little different too. Michael? Please identify yourself as well.
I'm Michael Hanneman, and I was involved in the state's attempt to deal with this 25 years ago, as well as in the state's work on Mono Lake, and also in the restoration of the San Joaquin River. I did the economic analysis for the environmental group. I think your assessment of how things work in California is idealistic and not right. The management of water quality in the Bay Delta is a massive failure in California. I have just finished a history of this, but the state tried to first took this up in a ruling in 1959, and it decided, the predecessor agency, and it decided to postpone the issue because it didn't have data. and it wanted the parties to reach agreement among themselves. It's 50 years later, nothing has advanced. They're still waiting for the parties, and the parties will never agree among themselves because this is a zero-sum game. And up to now, the state, the political leadership of the state has avoided this issue because they will make enemies. And so it remains an unresolved issue. Mono Lake is very interesting because that was a brilliant success. The state commissioned scientific studies, independent studies, used those studies and made a decision. Those studies involved measuring the economic value of the environment, the public trust. That has never been done in the Delta. The economic valuation of the Delta has been deliberately avoided to this day. And it reflects the difficulty of this issue and the fact that with a really complex issue, the political leadership steps back and hopes a solution will arise. So and this is not unusual in the Western states, although in my view California has done a particularly bad job. 8 of the 9 major rivers in the West are now under a court order because of the Endangered Species Act. This is an immense failure because water rights come under state law. And what it means is that in all of these states, the state has failed to come to grips with a basic trade-off or allocation issue of water rights versus environmental quality. And it is, and a judge finally, this comes to a judge, and a judge has to make a decision. It can't say, no, this is an unpopular issue. But having judges make these decisions is not a democratic or really a desirable mechanism, but it is. The other thing I want to say is, with the future, I worry about climate change. And I want to draw attention quickly to Australia, which has faced extreme drought for the last 10 years. So it's sort of a representation of the future. Australia's changed its water rights laws 3 times in the last 20 years. But it's gone to a strategy. It's abandoned the notion that particular users have a right to specific quantities of water, which they used to have, whether they're environmental or others. In the face of uncertainty, it's now gone to a system where users, including environmental users, have a right to a percentage of the runoff. But there is no one knows what the runoff will be next year. In other words, the notion is with climate change, the state cannot guarantee anything to anybody, or at least beyond a certain limit. And so that may mean we lose things because if the stream flow falls to historic lows, there's nothing that we can do. And so the logic of the Australia is the risk is placed on everybody. But everybody has percentages, and the base will be unknown until. And so everybody, including environmental managers, sort of has an incentive and an obligation to try and hedge, either literally by buying water, or by buying energy. But that may be the effect of climate change. Then, in effect, there's sort of no guarantees even for the environment. So Australia has raised the environmental percentage, but it's only a percentage.
Michael, if I could just comment on that very quickly. Bob and I, back in 2000, went on a trip to New Zealand, discovered that they had reorganized their entire government around water basins. We came back with some enthusiasm that maybe we could do something in California, but I think we've been beaten down somewhat.
When I was a graduate student, my professor wrote a paper in 1965 calling for water basin government in California. It was a good idea in 1965, and it's a good idea today.
Get up to the
I was quite involved in the drainage thing, and we wrote the book with Ariel Dinar. But one thing that was clear that, at least in my view, the only time in California that we really had action was during the drought of 1992. And during this drought, exactly what Tom said happened. To some extent, we had a water bank that was decided over a period of 48 hours. Basically, even though for years we basically suggested that we should have transferable right and trading, basically people look it down because of, honestly, because of the wars of the lawyers. I really think that the system in California now exists to some extent because we have a lot of individual parties that fight in the margin, and the solution will come almost by dictate during crisis situations. The thing that is really unfortunate that we have all these, in my view, frivolous lawsuits that relate to the Endangered Species Act, it's important where people have to make decisions. So I think the key point is to develop, and we really failed in this, to develop some sort of a commission or group or democratic excellent arrangement where we can think about these things deliberately. The same ideas about trading that were later on accepted. The Central Valley Improvement Act is another wonderful success. I think if there was one big success in California, the Central Valley Improvement Act, and that was really inspired Australia. So to some extent, what we really don't have, we don't have a system to take things out of code and to move it to the legislation agenda to reach some sort of solution. So we basically operate under shotgun
Okay, let
marriages.
me make a point. We have 4 minutes left. We have 3 questions. Let's try to give them. You want to come? Go
One
ahead.
quick statement in response to that. As a appointee, I'm not supposed to advocate and support any pieces of legislation, but I wanted to make you aware that Senator Fran Pavley, who of course carried the climate change bill, is carrying 2 pieces of legislation that are very, very pertinent to this issue. One is the creation of, basically these 2 legislation implements the recommendation of the Delta Vision Blue Ribbon Panel Task Force. So I would encourage you to check out those legislation.
Okay. I'm going to just do the 3 + 1, and that's it. And I would beg you just to make quick questions. Okay, go ahead. Identify yourself first.
This will only take me about 30 seconds. I'm Joan Denton. I'm with Cal EPA. To Gabrielle's point about endangered species, I think it would be interesting to watch now what's happened with the collapse of the Chinook salmon run. How is that going to affect water policy? It's not really known why it's collapsed, but it's thought to be because of water quality, because of reduction of stream flows, because of increase in temperature.
Okay.
But that's a very prime example, which I think is ripe to be followed as far as the theory that you have about public. As a Californian, that's a disaster to me.
Go ahead. Who wants to take that?
I agree.
Okay, over there.
Just a quick point about the Water Framework Directive. I think we have to understand that the Water Framework Directive in Europe has not changed the question of water rights. It has set up a system which tries to, on a water basin basis, look at all of the issues of quantity and quantity, look at all of the conflicting demands, and set a framework of logical decision-making. In my time in California, I've looked with Matt and some other people at how things are done here, and there are some similarities with Europe. I think what we had before the Water Framework Directive was an awful lot of ad hoc decision-making, which was very untransparent. We're a long way from getting full implementation of the directive, but I think one of the issues which I pick up from what Gerald was saying was that water rights are holy because there's money and historic rights and people have traded this and whatever. I think one of the difficulties in some of the issues you have in California is that there's an awful lot of public money being pumped into the water management in California in very untransparent ways, which is benefiting some people a lot more than others, whether it's about flood protection, whether it's about levees, et cetera, and I think the possible attraction to you of a Water Framework Directive approach is you put it all on the table, you lay it all out fairly openly, and you ask a few questions, even if some of the answers to those questions are a bit uncomfortable for some of the players in the game.
Okay. That was very diplomatically put, and I think you're right. This logical decision-making, we should think about that. That might be a good idea.
Okay, that one and then the final. Go ahead.
Andy Malley of EPA, and though I'm not speaking as a representative of EPA, nature has a way of sometimes correcting its mistakes over time, and quite often occurs through extreme events, whether it's a flood or a drought or other type of what we call natural disasters. We, humans, though, often then attempt, after this natural event, try to restore things the way they were, which we cannot do. Why can't also politically we realize it's a blank slate again? Why not rethink how we're actually managing that stuff?
I love it. Why don't you take it on?
Yeah. And you would get my vote, believe me.
Okay, final.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Gerald about his statement that it's dangerous because it's a lot of power plants near ocean, and they put hot water from cooling equipment of power plants. So from the common sense view, why don't lose energy in hot water?
Yeah.
Why? It's
Okay, is that your question? Okay.
because we need electric energy and we need heat water.
Sir, we're
to make
trying to
shower,
fish. We're
pools,
over
whatever.
time.
All right, let me respond to that. In terms of the discharge of the hot water from once-through cooling of the power plants, one of the things that is going on right now is there are several desalinization plants that are being proposed to operate in conjunction with these once-through cooling plants that indeed would use this preheated water within their own systems, and that would save them some money because it would help them from an energy point of view. There are obstacles to that because there is a great deal of pressure to phase out these once-through cooling plants. So I don't know whether that will eventually happen or not.
Great. Let's thank the panel. We're 1 minute over.
I'm going to tell you those pictures of Matt, the co-author of this, were taken in the upper Yangtze River just a few weeks ago. We had a chance to spend 8 days rafting down the Tiger Leaping Gorge, so that was for Matt.
Bob has a wonderful job.
Appreciate it.
I enjoyed it.
If I don't have a job tomorrow, you'll know why.
There is some strategic strength in this, and that's why you didn't get rid of PSA for 30 years because it's still really strong.
It is, and it is still really strong.
Yeah.
It's just only.
Yeah, I got your point, and I'm sure that the democracy in California many other things are set, among others.
The other thing, the disadvantage of the PSA is it might come up with Judge Ranger's decision.
Where do we put content? Is that a USB port? Maybe this will work. Let's see. Is this content? For content right here? Let's see. I don't know. Yeah, it's tiny, huh? That's the latest to Beijing. Yeah. Oh, okay. Cool. Yeah. I just need I like a mouse or a keyboard. Isn't that cute? Yeah, that's the latest from Beijing. It's 4 gigabytes. What they do is they took away the metal. They took the metal collar off. Yeah, it's so clever. Yeah, I got a copy of it. Beijing. Yeah. Nowadays they are.